She had spent 30 years being told she was too much and not enough all at once, too broad, too heavy, too plain, to be wanted, yet never enough to be kept. And then, on the worst morning of her life, a wagon came to carry her away to a broken ranch at the edge of nowhere, driven by a man with dead eyes and 3 wild children who had forgotten what a warm meal tasted like. Nobody believed anything good could yell from 2 people that hollowed out finding each other in the dark. They were wrong. Drop your city in the comments, stay until the very end, and tell me if this story finds something inside you that you thought was long gone. The morning Martha Bell Crowley left the town of Caldwell Flats, nobody came to see her off. That was not a surprise. It was not even a disappointment. Not really, because Martha had learned long before this particular Tuesday in October of 1883 that expecting a crowd to witness your pain was a luxury reserved for the beautiful and the beloved, and she was neither. She was 30 years old, broad across the shoulders, full in the face and waist, with thick, capable hands that had scrubbed and mended and carried since she was old enough to be put to use. She had her mother's dark eyes, which was the only inheritance her mother had been permitted to leave her before dying of a fever when Martha was barely 4, and she had her father's stubborn jaw, which had served her better than most things he had given her in life. She packed slowly, not because she was reluctant to go, but because she owned very little worth packing quickly. A dress in deep brown wool, another in faded blue cotton, patched twice at the elbows. A pair of worn boots resold by the cobbler on Merchant Street, paid for with 3 weeks of egg money she had skimmed from the household accounts before her stepmother could discover the savings. A small tin box that held a cameo brooch her mother had left behind, the only object in the world that Martha considered truly hers. A Bible dog-eared and soft with use. A single photograph of her father from before the drinking got bad, when he had still smiled with his whole face. She wrapped each item carefully in her 1 spare petticoat, folded the bundle into her canvas traveling bag, and stood in the center of the small back room that had been her quarters for the past 9 years. The room smelled of damp wood and lye soap. It was cold. It had always been cold because the window faced north, and the single wool blanket she had been allocated was not thick enough for a woman her size, which her stepmother Vivian had pointed out on numerous occasions as evidence of Martha's unreasonable demands on the household resources. The irony that Martha was the one who had kept those resources from dwindling entirely through 12-hour days of cooking and cleaning and mending and tending the kitchen garden had never once struck Vivian Crowley as worthy of acknowledgement. Martha did not look around the room when she left it. There was nothing to feel tender about. She carried her bag down the narrow back stairs and through the kitchen, which she had already cleaned before dawn, out of habit she could not suppress even on the morning of her departure. The floors were swept. The stove was blacked. The breakfast dishes from Vivian and her daughter Cecily's early meal were washed and stacked with precision Martha had never been thanked for and would not be thanked for now. Vivian was waiting in the front parlor, standing beside the fireplace, with her arms folded across her narrow chest and an expression of satisfied impatience on her face. She was a handsome woman in the way that certain cold things are handsome, sharp-featured, and well-dressed, and utterly without warmth. Cecily sat in the velvet chair by the window, 22 years old, and lovely in the conventional frontier sense, with her pale ringlets and her mother's calculating eyes, looking out at the street with the elaborate disinterest of someone who is very interested indeed. On the small writing desk beside the fireplace lay a document. Martha had already read it twice in the small hours of the night before holding her lantern close to the dense legal script. A labor contract. Her name at the top and below it, the name of one Ezekiel Harrow of Black Hollow Ridge, Harrow County, 3 days wagon ride to the northwest. The contract transferred her indenture for a period of 1 year in exchange for the cancellation of 1/4 of her father's outstanding debts, which had turned out upon his death 6 weeks ago to be considerable, catastrophic, and almost entirely unknown to Martha, until the lawyer arrived with his leather case and his carefully neutral expression. Her father, Thomas Crowley, had gambled. He had done it quietly, in the back rooms of establishments that did not appear on the respectable maps of Caldwell Flats, and he had done it badly for a very long time. The debts were attached to the house, to the small parcel of land behind it, to the furniture and the livestock, and very nearly to the air inside the walls. Vivian, who had married Thomas Crowley for security and had received the opposite, was disposing of assets with focused efficiency. Martha was an asset. "The wagon will be here within the half hour," Vivian said without preamble or greeting. "Try not to embarrass yourself or this family." Martha looked at her steadily. She was good at steadiness. It was a skill developed the same way all survival skills are developed, by having no alternative. "Is there anything else you require me to sign?" Martha asked. "It's done. Mr. Harrow's man will have a copy of the contract." Vivian reached for her coffee cup, then paused, and something moved across her face that might have been the ghost of conscience. It did not survive. "You should know," she said in the lower voice she used when she was enjoying something privately, "that Harrow Ranch has a reputation. People in the county call it the cursed property. 2 tragedies in 3 years. The man himself is said to be half mad with grief. No housekeeper will stay more than a month." "Then perhaps he needs one who has nowhere else to go," Martha said. Vivian's lips pressed together. "Don't develop ideas about your situation, Martha. You're being sent there because you are useful, not because you are valued. There is a considerable difference." Martha picked up her traveling bag. Cecily turned from the window then and looked at her stepsister with an expression that walked the careful line between pity and contempt. She was holding a small hand mirror, as she often was checking the arrangement of her curls. "Will you manage, do you think?" she asked in the solicitous tone she used when she wanted to sound kind without the inconvenience of being kind. "It does sound terribly remote." "I'll manage," Martha said. She moved toward the front door. She had her hand on the brass knob, the familiar cool weight of it, when Vivian spoke again. The words were very quiet. That was the thing about Vivian at her worst. She never shouted. She understood that the quieter the cruelty, the deeper it cut, because there was no raised voice to push back against, no drama to accuse her of. Just a low, certain pronouncement delivered to the back of Martha's head like a blade between the shoulder blades. "Good riddance," Vivian said. "It's not as if any man would ever choose to marry a creature like you." Martha stood very still for exactly 3 seconds. She did not turn around. She did not answer. She opened the door and walked through it, and closed it behind her with a soft, controlled click, and she stood on the porch in the pale October light, and breathed in cold air that smelled of wood smoke and horse and the distant bite of coming winter. And she waited for the pain to do what it always did, which was crest and subside, like a wave that knows it cannot change the shore, only remind it of the ocean's existence. She had heard variations of that sentence for most of her conscious life. From Vivian, yes, but before Vivian there had been schoolyard cruelty, and the knowing looks of church ladies, and the careful indifference of the young men of Caldwell Flats, who looked through her at the prettier girls behind her, and her father, in his bad years, asking why she couldn't be more like Cecily. More like her mother had been, more like something other than what she was. She was not built like the women in the fashion plates. She was not built like Cecily. She was built like a woman designed by necessity, rather than admiration, wide and strong and enduring, and the world had made very sure she understood that this was a failing. She had stopped weeping about it somewhere around her 22nd year. What remained was not numbness exactly. Martha was not a numb person. She felt things with considerable depth, and kept most of it below the surface, the way deep water is still water, even when you cannot see the bottom. What remained was a very clear and quiet certainty about what she could and could not hope for. She could hope for a fair day's work and a fair night's rest. She could hope for small dignities, a clean room, a civil employer, the satisfaction of a task completed well. She had given up in the manner of someone setting down a burden too heavy for the road ahead any hope of the other thing, the larger thing, the thing Vivian had just described with her habitual poisoned precision. Martha was not going to be chosen. She understood that. She had understood it for years with the weary acceptance of someone who has recalculated the same sum too many times to expect a different answer. She only wanted a quiet corner of the world where her existence was not treated as an inconvenience. The wagon arrived 23 minutes later, driven by a young man with a weathered face and a reluctant manner who introduced himself as Cal, a hand from Harrow Ranch. He did not offer to take her bag, but he did not comment on her appearance or her size, which she registered as a modest kindness. He simply nodded at the wagon bed and climbed back to his seat, and Martha lifted her bag and herself up without assistance and settled on the rough wooden bench, and they rolled out of Caldwell Flats as the church bell struck 8 o'clock. She did not look back. She watched the town recede through the gaps in the canvas siding, the familiar storefronts, and the dust and the ordinary busyness of a morning she had no further part in, and she felt the specific lightness of a person released from a place that was never kind to them. It was not happiness. It was something quieter and less celebratory than happiness. It was the first breath after a long pressure, the easing of something that has been clenched for so long you have forgotten it was clenched. The road northwest was not easy. It wound through hill country that grew progressively more severe as the day advanced, the gentle amber plains giving way to rocky ridges and narrow passes where the pines stood dark and close on both sides, and the sky narrowed to a pale ribbon above. Cal was not a conversational companion. He answered direct questions with brief accuracy and volunteered nothing. From him she learned that there were 3 children at the ranch that the last housekeeper had left in March, that it was a working cattle operation, though the herd was diminished, and that Mr. Harrow was, in Cal's exact words, particular about quiet. She slept some in the rocking motion of the wagon with her bag under her head and her coat pulled close. The kind of thin, exhausted sleep that comes to people who have been perpetually tired for too long. She woke when they stopped to water the horses at a creek, and ate the bread and dried beef she had thought to pack for herself, since no provisions had been made for the journey by her stepmother, and watched the water move over the stones with the idle, philosophical attention of someone who has too much to think about any of it directly. They camped one night on the road, Cal laying a fire without ceremony, and producing a small pot of beans from a pack behind the seat. He gave her a portion without being asked, which she ate, with gratitude she did not overexpress, knowing that men like Cal were made uncomfortable by excessive thanks. She slept under the wagon with her coat for a blanket, and woke to frost on the grass and the horse's breath making clouds in the cold morning air, and she rose and rebuilt the fire herself, while Cal was still rolling his blankets, because she did not know how to be still in the morning. It was not in her nature to wait for someone else to do the thing she could see needed doing. They arrived at Black Hollow Ridge on the afternoon of the 3rd day. She had expected bleakness because Vivian had described it as bleak, and because the reputation of a cursed ranch does not generally conjure images of prosperity and cheer. But the reality was something more nuanced than simple bleakness. And Martha, who was a precise observer, noticed the nuance. The property sat in a hollow between 2 ridges, sheltered from the worst of the northwestern wind. The land itself was good. She could see that, well watered by a creek that ran clear along the eastern boundary and grassed with the thick native growth that meant deep roots and reliable grazing. The fences needed repair 3 rails down on the south side alone that she could see from the wagon track. The barn wanted paint. The main house, a substantial two-story structure of hewn logs with a stone chimney, had a porch step that had rotted through on the left side and a window on the upper floor with a crack running diagonally across the glass stuffed with rag to keep the cold out. The kitchen garden was dead and overgrown, gone to seed and frost. It was a property in grief, she thought. Not a failed property. A grieving one. There was a difference. Failure is an ending. Grief is a suspension, a held breath, a refusal to move forward that contains within it the buried possibility of movement. She did not say this to Cal. He pulled the wagon up before the house and climbed down, and she followed, dropping to the ground with the solid practicality of someone accustomed to managing her own body in difficult terrain. She was standing with her bag at her feet, looking at the house, when the door opened. The three children appeared first. They came out in a cluster not arranged by age or any social order, just tumbled out together like a single creature with multiple heads staring at her with the frank and unashamed appraisal of children who have not been taught to pretend they are not looking. The oldest was a girl, perhaps 11, with a narrow face and her arms crossed over her chest in a posture that Martha recognized as protective rather than hostile a child who had learned to present a hard surface to the world because the world had hit her with hard things. Behind her, a boy of about 8, gap-toothed and wide-eyed with mud on both knees and his shirt tail completely untucked. And behind him, clinging to the older girl's skirt with both fists, a small girl no more than 5. With enormous dark eyes and a quantity of tangled dark hair that suggested no one had attempted to comb it in some time. They looked at Martha. Martha looked at them. She did not perform warmth. She did not feel, did not crouch down and coo and try to make herself smaller and less intimidating, because she had been around children enough to know that they could detect performance with unerring accuracy and trusted it not at all. She simply looked at them honestly, taking stock, letting them take stock of her. "I'm Martha," she said, not loudly. "I'm here to help run the house." The older girl's chin came up a fraction. "Our last housekeeper cried all the time," she said, as if reporting a scientific observation. "She cried when she burned the porridge, and she cried when the fox got in the chicken coop, and she cried when Uncle Zeke didn't talk to her at supper. Then she left." "I don't cry easily," Martha said. "The porridge is fixable. Foxes require a better latch, and I don't require conversation at supper." The girl studied her for a long moment. "I'm Eliza," she said finally. "That's Henry, and that's Ruth. Ruth doesn't talk much." "Hello, Eliza. Henry. Ruth." Martha glanced at the small one who was still gripping Eliza's skirt and regarding Martha with those enormous eyes. "Ruth, do you like biscuits?" The smallest child said nothing, but something shifted in her expression, a fractional softening the way ice sounds before it begins to give. "We all like biscuits," Henry announced with the declarative authority of a boy who considered himself an authority on most things. "We haven't had good biscuits since Mrs. Pell left in March." "Then we'll start there," Martha said. It was at this moment that the man appeared in the doorway. She had been given no physical description of Ezekiel Harrow, only his name, and the broad outlines of his circumstance. And so she had formed no expectation, which was perhaps why the reality of him hit with the particular clarity of something unexpected. He was tall, considerably over 6 feet, with the kind of frame that spoke of hard labor, sustained over many years, wide through the chest and shoulders lean everywhere else. He was perhaps 35, though something in the set of his face and the weight behind his eyes suggested that the years he had lived had compressed themselves, packed in tightly accumulated, a density that age alone does not explain. His hair was dark and in need of cutting, curling at the collar of his flannel shirt. He had not shaved in several days. He stood in the doorway with one shoulder against the frame and looked at her, and it was a different kind of looking than the children's frank appraisal. It was the look of a man assessing a situation, taking inventory of variables, calculating load-bearing capacity. She was an employee arriving. He was determining whether she would be adequate for the requirements of the position. She looked back at him with the same steady equanimity she had offered the children, because she had nothing to hide and nothing to prove, and she was very tired of performing smallness for people who had not earned the performance. "Miss Crowley," he said. His voice was low, with the flat directness of a man who had shed social pleasantries as unnecessary weight. "Mr. Harrow," she said, "Cal tell you the terms. He told me what he knew. I've read the contract. The room is off the kitchen, small." He paused, something flickering behind his eyes that she could not yet read. "Last housekeeper complained about the size." "I won't complain," she said. He studied her for another moment. Then he pushed off the doorframe and turned back into the house, leaving the door open, which she took as an invitation to follow, or at least as the absence of an instruction not to. "Supper at 6, he said without turning around. "Hands eat with the family. 8 of them. Biscuits, if you can manage it." "I can manage it," she said, and picked up her bag and followed him inside. The kitchen was a large room, which was the first thing in its favor. The stove was a good one, a heavy 6-lid cast iron range that only needed blacking and a thorough inspection of the flue. The work surfaces were substantial, scarred with use, but solid. The pantry was poorly stocked, but not empty enough flour and dried goods to work with if she was careful and creative, which she always was. The room smelled of cold grease and disuse, the particular staleness of a kitchen where no one has cooked with care or regularity for months. Martha set her bag down. She opened the firebox of the stove, checked the flue damper, laid a fire with the wood stacked beside it, and had the fire going before she took off her coat. She found the black iron pot, the mixing bowls, the sack of flour, the baking powder, the lard. She calculated quantities with the automatic efficiency of long practice. There were 8 ranch hands and 1 hard-eyed employer and 3 children watching her from the doorway of the kitchen with varying degrees of covert attention. She did not look at any of them directly. She simply began. The biscuits she made that first evening were not her best work. She was working with an unfamiliar stove in poor light, with ingredients she was still measuring by instinct, adjusting for the altitude and the age of the baking powder. But they were warm and soft, and they rose correctly, and they filled the kitchen with the smell of hot bread, which is a smell that does something particular to people who have not had enough of it. She made a pot of beef stew from the dried beef in the pantry, and the root vegetables she found in the cold cellar, leaner than she liked, but flavored carefully with the dried herbs she found in a cracked crock on the pantry shelf. And she made it stretch further than its ingredients suggested it should. When she set the food on the long table in the dining room, she did not call them. She simply stood back and let the smell do it. They came in 1s and 2s, the ranch hands' large, rough-edged men, who sat down with the cautious hope of people who have not trusted a meal in a long time. Henry arrived at a run and slid into his seat with the momentum of a boy who has never learned to enter a room at reduced speed. Eliza came in quietly and sat with the precise posture of someone performing composure. Ruth was carried in by Eliza, the small girl still clutching her sister's sleeve, and deposited in a chair with a folded blanket on the seat to bring her to table height. Ezekiel Harrow came last. He sat at the head of the table and looked at the food for a moment, and Martha, standing near the kitchen doorway, where she intended to eat later when the men were finished, saw something move across his face. It was small and quickly suppressed, but she had become very good at reading suppressed things. It was not surprise exactly. It was something rawer, something that looked, for just a fraction of a moment, like grief, but grief of the particular kind that appears when something you had nearly stopped believing in presents itself unexpectedly, like a candle in a window you had passed 100 times, dark. He bowed his head briefly. The children followed, and the hands, some of them remembering at different moments that this was the custom, ducking their heads with varying degrees of belatedness. He did not speak a grace aloud. Just that brief lowering, that private acknowledgment of something. Then he reached for the biscuits, and the meal began. No one said anything to Martha for the duration of the meal, which suited her. She ate alone at the kitchen table, after as she had planned, listening to the sounds of the dining room with the attentiveness of someone gathering information. Conversation was sparse but not hostile. Henry told a long story about a rabbit he had found near the south fence that seemed to have a broken leg. One of the ranch hands, an older man with a gray beard, who she would later learn was named Fletcher, told Henry that a rabbit with a broken leg was a rabbit for the stew pot, and Henry argued this point with considerable passion, and she heard in Eliza's quiet voice the words, "Henry, enough," and the argument ceased. Ezekiel Harrow said nothing during any of this. Not a word of correction, not a word of affirmation. Just the silence of a man who has pulled himself so far inside himself that the outside world barely reaches him. When the hands had gone back to the bunkhouse and the children had been directed toward bed by Eliza, who seemed to have assumed this role without being assigned it, Martha washed the dishes and set the kitchen to rights and went to inspect the room she had been given. It was indeed small, 7 feet by 9, with a narrow iron bed, a washstand, a single hook on the wall for clothing, and one small window that looked out on the kitchen garden. The mattress was thin but clean. There was a lamp on the washstand and a half-full oil reservoir. The floor was bare-board cold under her feet when she removed her boots. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dim light and looked at the small window and the dark shape of the overgrown garden beyond it, silver-tipped by the quarter moon, and she thought about Vivian's parting words, the way you probe a bruise, checking its edges, taking its measure. It was not as if any man would ever choose to marry a creature like you. She let the sentence sit there for a moment, turning it in her mind with the careful neutrality of long practice. Then she folded it away in the deep internal place where she kept the other things she had been required to survive. She was not here for that. She had released that particular hope before she boarded the wagon deliberately, and with a conscious grief she had allowed herself privately in the cold back room in Caldwell Flats on the last night after the house went quiet. She had mourned it then, the whole imaginary life that people like Vivian and Cecily and the careful world had informed her was not available to a woman of her appearance and circumstance, and she had wept some quietly, with her face in the pillow, and then she had dried her face and been done with it. She was here to do a job. She was here to earn her keep, and perhaps in time enough of a wage to build something of her own. A small room in a boarding house. A kitchen she had authority over. A corner of the world where she owed no one an apology for the space she occupied. She lay down on the narrow bed fully dressed because she was too tired to manage anything else, and pulled the thin blanket up and was asleep before the lamp burned down. In the morning she was up before 4, blacking the stove and setting the flue to draw properly, because she had noted the previous evening that the draw was slightly wrong and would improve with adjustment. She found the coffee and made it strong as ranch hands required. She made a double batch of biscuits, a pot of oatmeal with dried apple, and a pan of fried salt pork. When the hands came in at 5:30, stamping cold from their boots, the kitchen was warm and the food was on the table, and Martha was already assessing the state of the pantry shelves with a list she was compiling in her head of what needed to be ordered and what could be improvised. She was aware of the small moment of arrested motion in the doorway as the men came in and found the kitchen warm and the meal ready. She was aware of them looking at each other with the cautious optimism of people who have been disappointed before and are reluctant to admit they are hopeful. She paid this no particular attention. She turned back to her pantry assessment. Ezekiel Harrow did not come down until 6. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her, then at the stove, then at the table visible through the doorway beyond. "You were up before the hands," he said. "I like a head start." she said. He said nothing. He poured his coffee, drank half of it, standing at the window in the gray pre-dawn light, and went back out the kitchen door, closing behind him. Martha added coffee to her inventory list and continued. The children discovered over the first week that the kitchen in the morning was the warmest room in the house, and that Martha did not chase them out of it. This was, she suspected, a change from previous arrangements. She did not make a production of welcoming them. She simply did not exclude them, and moved around their small bodies with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to managing space efficiently, and occasionally handed them something to do. Stir this, hold, this, bring me that bowl from the third shelf. Henry was an enthusiastic if chaotic assistant who spilled things with cheerful regularity. Eliza was precise and observant, watching the processes with the careful attention of a child who is learning without admitting she is learning. Ruth sat on the footstool near the warmth of the stove and watched everything with those enormous dark eyes and said very little. But one morning, when Martha set a biscuit on the small plate she had begun keeping on the footstool at Ruth's height, the small girl looked up at her and said clearly and deliberately, "Thank you." It was the first time Martha had heard Ruth's voice. She did not make a fuss of it. She simply said, "You're welcome, Ruth," and went back to the stove and felt something settle quietly in her chest like a bird landing. The ranch had other requirements beyond feeding its inhabitants. The state of the household management was, she discovered systematically over the first 2 weeks, a kind of slow emergency that had been developing since the previous spring. The mending pile alone represented months of accumulated need shirts, worn through at the elbows socks, with holes the size of a fist, children's clothing, outgrown and not replaced. The cold cellar needed organizing and stocking before the deep winter came. The kitchen garden, dead though it was, needed to be cleared and turned and covered with straw against the spring planting. The chickens had been let run loose and were laying in scattered, unpredictable locations, which was why egg collection had become a daily adventure rather than a practical harvest. Martha addressed these things one at a time with the methodical efficiency of a person who has learned that feeling overwhelmed is a luxury and that the alternative to starting is not starting, which is worse. She rose before 4 every morning and worked until after 9 at night. She did not complain. She had not been given a space in which to complain, and in any case the work itself was not her complaint. She had always worked. Work was the medium through which she had always moved the element she knew best, the place where the question of her worthiness was settled by something concrete and inarguable. She had made a meal, or she had not. The floor was clean, or it was not. These were answerable questions, and she took considerable private comfort in them. It was in the 3rd week of her residence at Black Hollow Ridge that she had her first real exchange with Ezekiel Harrow. She had been attempting to fix the kitchen garden fence, the one that had been letting the ranch dogs into the chicken yard with predictable results, and she had discovered that the post on the northeast corner had rotted through at the ground line and needed replacing. She had the new post. She did not have the post hole digger because it was not in the tool shed, and after looking everywhere logical, she went to find Cal, who told her it was in the barn, and in the barn she ran into Ezekiel Harrow. He was working on a saddle, seated on a low stool near the main doors, doing the careful, exacting work of restitching a broken billet, with the focused concentration of a man who is grateful to have something that requires focused concentration. He looked up when she came in, not startled, just measuring. "Post hole digger," she said, "for the garden fence. Cal said it was here." "East wall," he said, "behind the grain boards." She found it. She was maneuvering it back toward the door when he spoke again. "That fence has needed work since August," he said, not with any particular inflection. "It needs it now, too," she said. "The northeast corner post is rotted through. I have the new post." There was a pause in the sound of the stitching awl. "That's not part of your contract," he said. "No," she agreed. Another pause. "It's heavy work." "Yes," she said. She was at the door when he said, "I'll do it this afternoon." She turned and looked at him. He was looking at the saddle. His voice had been flat and neutral, the way it always was, giving nothing of itself away. She could not tell if it was an offer or a dismissal, or simply an efficiency calculation. "I can manage it," she said. "I know you can," he said. "I'll do it this afternoon." She stood there for a moment holding the post-hole digger and thought that this was as close to consideration as a man like Ezekiel Harrow probably got, and that it was more than she had been offered in a very long time, and she said, "Thank you, Mr. Harrow," and took the post-hole digger back and went to do the rest of the fence repair that she could manage without it. And that afternoon he fixed the corner post, and she did not mention it, and he did not mention it, and the chicken yard was secured. She thought about this later in her small, cold room with a kind of careful neutrality. She was not going to build anything on a fence post. She was not that foolish. But there was, she admitted to herself, something in that small exchange that she turned over once or twice in the quiet of her own mind in the way that someone who has been cold for a very long time will turn toward the smallest source of heat, not because it is enough, but because warmth is warmth, and the body remembers what it requires. She put it away with the other things she kept carefully catalogued and controlled in the interior spaces of herself, and she went to sleep, and she rose before 4, and she did her work. Black Hollow Ridge was not a comfortable place. The grief in it was real and structural, embedded in the silences of a man who would not speak of what he had lost, and the watchfulness of 3 children who had learned that the world could remove things from you without warning or apology. But beneath that grief, she had begun to perceive the outlines of what the place had been and might be again. Good land, a sound house, a herd that was thin but not broken, ranch hands who did their work without enthusiasm but without failure, 3 children who were smart and sturdy and in need of something she could not yet name, but could feel the shape of in the way you feel the shape of a room in the dark. She was not here to save anyone, she reminded herself. She was here to do her job. She was here to earn enough to build her quiet corner, her small, dignified life, her kitchen and her room, and her freedom from obligation to people who had found her burdensome. She was not here to need. She was very clear about this. She told it to herself every evening in the small room off the kitchen, with the cold pressing against the single pane of the north-facing window, and the sounds of the ranch settling into night all around her, and the steady, warm weight of a day's work behind her, and she believed it mostly with the determined conviction of someone who knows that the alternative to believing it is dangerous. She believed it right up until the moment she didn't, which was further into the story than she could have predicted, and which arrived, as such moments always do not, in any dramatic revelation, but in the smallest, most particular of acts. But that was still ahead of her. For now she was only 30 years old and newly arrived at a broken ranch at the edge of the world, and she was doing her work, and that was enough, and she had decided it was enough, and she was keeping that decision very firmly in both hands. The cold deepened as November settled over Black Hollow Ridge with the particular authority of a season that intends to be taken seriously. The creek along the eastern boundary developed a skin of ice each morning that lasted longer into the afternoon with every passing week, and the grass on the ridgelines turned the color of old straw, and the cattle drifted closer to the sheltered hollow of their own accord, the way animals understand weather in their bones before it arrives. Martha understood the cold in her own way. She had spent enough winters in inadequately heated rooms to know how to insulate herself against it practically and otherwise. She added a second kettle to the back of the stove in the evenings, letting the steam soften the dry air. She found extra blankets in a cedar chest in the upstairs hall, shook the dust from them, and without asking permission, placed one on each of the children's beds and a second one on her own. She began cooking more stews and fewer dry heat meals because the long simmer of a pot on the back of the stove added warmth to the kitchen by degrees over the course of a day, and because the children ate soup in a different way Then they ate other things with a quieter, more settled attention, as if the warmth of the bowl was reaching into places that food alone did not ordinarily touch. She did not tell herself she was doing this for them. She told herself she was doing it because a warm kitchen was an efficiently run kitchen, and a fed child was a child who did not interrupt the work with the particular chaos of hunger-driven behavior. She was very good at practical explanations. Eliza was the one she understood best, which was perhaps because Eliza reminded her of herself at 11 in the specific way that children who have had to grow up before their time carry a certain recognizable posture of premature responsibility. The girl managed her younger siblings with a competence that should not have been required of an 11-year-old waking Henry when he would not wake, braiding Ruth's hair with unpracticed determination, reminding both of them to do the small daily tasks that kept a household functional. She did all of this without complaint and without apparent expectation of acknowledgement, which was, Martha knew, the posture of a child who has learned that acknowledgement is not reliably available and has adjusted her expectations accordingly. Martha acknowledged her, not with excessive praise, which Eliza would have found suspicious and which would have rung false from a woman as constitutionally reserved as Martha herself. She acknowledged her in small, specific ways. She said, "That is well done," when Eliza repaired a tear in Ruth's pinafore with a neat, even stitch. She said, "You have a good eye," when Eliza noticed that the salt pork was beginning to turn before Martha caught it herself. She asked her opinion on small domestic decisions, the placement of the new shelf bracket in the pantry, whether the parlor rug should be beaten today or tomorrow, given the wind direction. She treated Eliza's judgment as a real thing worthy of consideration because it was, and because no one appeared to have been doing this before she arrived. Eliza received these small acknowledgments with a careful, contained pleasure that she did not perform, but that Martha could see in the slight loosening of the permanent tension the girl carried in her shoulders, in the way she began to arrive in the kitchen in the mornings a few minutes earlier each week, as if drawn by something she had not yet named for herself. Henry was simpler to read and more demanding of management. He was the kind of boy who moved through the world at a velocity slightly too high for most indoor environments, who meant well in every instance and broke things regularly, whose feelings lived very close to the surface and expressed themselves without the social editing that older people develop as a matter of survival. He had latched onto Martha in the direct, uncomplicated way of young children who have decided that a person is safe showing up at her elbow with the rabbit he had been caring for in a box in the barn, presenting it for inspection with the gravity of someone producing important evidence. The rabbit's leg was splinted with a small piece of flat wood and wrapped with a strip of cloth that Martha recognized as having once been part of her oldest spare handkerchief. She did not say anything about the handkerchief. She examined the rabbit with appropriate seriousness and told Henry that the splint looked secure and the animal was eating, which were both good signs. Henry's face in that moment was the specific face of a child receiving confirmation that the world is sometimes occasionally capable of rewarding care. She looked at that face and felt something move through her chest that she identified as inconvenient and filed accordingly. Ruth was the one she thought about most in the quiet of her room at night. The small girl had begun slowly and without announcement to follow her around the kitchen with the wordless attachment of a child who has found something stable and is testing whether it will hold. She did not ask for things. She simply appeared on her footstool, watching. She accepted what Martha gave her with those enormous dark eyes and that private face. And she had begun very gradually to speak in small bursts, single words mostly, and the occasional short sentence, always directed at Martha, never at anyone else in the room. A private channel that Martha honored with the care it deserved, leaning close and listening without making the child feel observed. She knew without being told directly what the children's story was. Cal had given her the broad outline in that economical way of his on the road from Caldwell Flats. Their parent, Zeke's younger brother Daniel, and his wife had died in a house fire 2 years previous. The cause of the fire was not something Cal specified, and she did not press. Zeke had taken the children, in the three of them suddenly transplanted from the family they had known into this silent, grief-struck ranch managed by an uncle who was himself barely managing, who provided for their physical needs because he was a man who understood obligation, but who was operating at such a depth of personal darkness that the emotional requirements of three orphaned children were, she suspected, entirely beyond his current reach. She did not judge him for this. She had seen enough of grief to understand that it was not a character failing. Grief at sufficient depth was simply a condition, like a broken bone, that has to be held still before it can begin to mend, and the holding still looked from the outside very much like absence. Ezekiel Harrow was present on his property and absent from it simultaneously in the way of a man who has retreated to some interior room of himself and locked the door from the inside. He was not cruel. He did not neglect the practical requirements of the children or the ranch. He rose before dawn and worked until after dark with a physical thoroughness that was almost punishing, as if labor were a sentence he was serving. He ate the meals Martha set before him, said almost nothing at the table, and disappeared back into the work with the focused single-mindedness of someone who has found in hard physical exertion the only reliable method of keeping the interior noise below bearable levels. Martha observed this without comment, the way she observed most things, with a careful attention that did not announce itself. She observed that he checked on the children every night before he went to bed. She knew this because her room was off the kitchen, and the stairs that led to the children's rooms on the second floor passed near the kitchen wall, and she could hear the footsteps, slow and deliberate, going up at approximately 9 o'clock each night, and the long pause on the landing, and then the footsteps returning. Every night without exception, even on the nights when she could tell from the quality of his silence at supper that the day had been particularly bad. He checked on them every night. She filed this away with the fence post in the part of her internal catalog reserved for things she was not going to make anything of, but could not entirely stop noticing. The ranch hands ate with a gratitude they expressed through the particular male code of not leaving food on the table and returning their plates to the kitchen with a degree of care that they did not apply to most objects. Fletcher, the oldest hand, who had the gray beard and the careful manners of a man who had been raised to know better and had spent decades in circumstances that did not require him to demonstrate it, began saying thank you when he collected his supper quietly and without making a point of it, and then the others gradually followed the way. Behavior spread through groups of people who spend their days in close proximity to each other. She did not comment on this either. She accepted the thanks with a nod and went on with her work. The work was relentless, and she met it with the relentlessness she had available, which was considerable. She had been right that the place was a grieving property rather than a failed one, and she approached the task of its revival with the systematic attention of someone who has diagnosed a problem correctly and is applying the appropriate remedy one task at a time in order of urgency. The food supply for the winter was her first priority. The cold cellar stocked and organized against the months ahead. The mending pile was her second, worked through in the evenings by lamplight after the kitchen was clean. The chicken yard, producing reliably, was her third. The children, clothed adequately against the deepening cold, was her fourth, achieved through the creative repurposing of fabric she found in a trunk in the upstairs storeroom, an old curtain panel that became a winter coat for Ruth, with enough left over for a warm hat, a wool blanket with moth holes in the border, but good fabric in the center that became a lined vest for Henry. She was not trying to impress anyone. This was the thought she returned to each time she noticed herself doing something that went beyond the strict letter of her contract. She was doing these things because they needed to be done, and because she was constitutionally incapable of walking past a need she had the capacity to address, and because the alternative, doing only what was required and no more, felt like a kind of internal diminishment she was not willing to accept. She was made to do thorough work. It was the only arena of her life in which no one had ever told her she was inadequate. It was in the 5th week, during the first hard freeze of the season that she had the exchange with Ezekiel Harrow that she replayed afterward more times than was wise. She had been in the barn checking on one of the calves that had shown signs of scours the previous afternoon, a young one that had been born late in the season and was less hardy than she should have been. Martha had some experience with livestock illness from her father's small holding in the years before the gambling took everything, and she knew that young calves with scours could fail rapidly if not monitored and supported. She had come out after supper in the cold and the dark with a lantern and the bottle of electrolyte mixture she had prepared from the supplies she found in the barn medicine cabinet, which she had reorganized in her second week because its previous state of disorder had made it functionally useless. She was kneeling in the straw beside the calf, coaxing the animal to take the electrolyte from a clean cloth when she heard Zeke come in. She knew his footstep by that point, the way it landed deliberate and even, and the particular quality of his silences. She did not look up. She was focused on the calf. He stood at the edge of the stall and looked at her for a moment. "She ate this afternoon," he said. "I thought she was improving." "She is," Martha said. "But she needs support tonight. She's not strong enough yet to lose any more fluid in the cold." There was a pause. She heard him move, and then he was crouching on the other side of the calf, not in the straw, but on the wooden slat at the base of the stall, studying the animal with that focused, assessing look he gave to problems that required solving. "You don't have to be out here," he said. "This isn't your work." "Someone needed to check her," Martha said. He looked at her, then across the back of the calf in the dim, warm circle of the lantern light. She met his eyes briefly and returned her attention to the cloth and the calf. "What do you think?" he said. She appreciated that he asked it as a real question. "I think she'll make it through if she stays warm tonight. The scours is slowing. Her eyes are better than this afternoon." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the calf. "My wife used to sit with sick animals," he said. It was the first time he had mentioned his wife directly, and by reference. It landed in the silence of the barn with the weight of something seldom handled, taken from a careful place. Martha did not look up. She did not fill the space with well-meaning noise, did not offer the reflexive condolences of someone who is uncomfortable with silence. She simply let the words exist in the air between them, which seemed to be the right thing because he did not close up or move away. "She'd have done the same thing," he said. "The electrolyte mix. She knew the recipe." "It's an old remedy," Martha said neutrally, giving him room. "Yes," he said. He stayed for another 10 minutes, not talking, just present on the other side of the calf, and they worked together in a companionable silence that Martha was careful not to assign too much meaning to. When the calf had taken enough and settled into the straw with the small involuntary sigh of an animal whose discomfort has eased, Zeke stood and offered Martha his hand to help her up from the kneeling position with the automatic courtesy of a man who was raised with manners even if he had stopped performing most of them. She took it because her knees were cold and stiff, and refusing the help would have been foolish. His hand was large and very warm, and he held on for just a moment after she was upright steadying her, and then released it without comment. "Thank you," she said, "for the help." "You didn't need the help," he said. "No," she agreed, "but it was good to have." And he took the lantern from the hook, and they walked back to the house through the cold dark together, not speaking their breath, making parallel clouds in the freezing air, and Martha's hand, the one he had held, was still warm inside her coat pocket, and she was very firm with herself about this, categorically and without exception. She was still being firm with herself about it 3 days later when he noticed her hands. She had developed blisters on the outer edge of both palms from the handle of the axe she used to split the kindling each morning because the handle had a rough spot she had been meaning to sand and had not yet found the time for. She had been splitting more kindling than the previous arrangement called for because she had identified that the house was habitually underheated. In the mornings, the fires allowed to die too low overnight, and that correcting this required more kindling for faster-building morning fires. She had addressed the rough axe handle with a strip of cloth wound around it as a temporary measure. But the damage to her palms was already done, and the cold and the constant work kept the blisters from healing properly. She had taken to keeping her hands busy enough that she did not think about them. She was at the kitchen table well after 9 in the evening, working through the mending pile by the good light of the lamp she had positioned carefully for that purpose when Zeke appeared in the kitchen doorway. This was not unusual. He sometimes came for a late cup of coffee, moving through the kitchen with the self-contained purposefulness of a man accustomed to existing in domestic spaces without quite belonging to them. She looked up briefly and returned to her work, a shirt of Fletcher's with a torn collar that required careful stitching to lie flat. She did not notice him stop until he spoke. "Your hands," he said. She had not been aware of holding the needle with enough grip to reveal the blisters, but apparently she had been because he was standing beside the table, now not behind her but to the side within the lamp's circle, looking at her right hand with an expression she could not immediately interpret. She looked down at her own hand. The blisters had broken at some point in the day she had not noticed when, and the skin around them was raw and reddened, and she had been gripping the needle harder than she realized to compensate for the tenderness. "They're fine," she said automatically. He did not say anything. He reached out and took her hand by the wrist carefully, but with a certainty that was not asking permission, and turned it to the lamplight. She sat very still, which was the response her body arrived at when surprised a deep-trained stillness that was the physical equivalent of making herself small. She expected him to comment on the inefficiency of it, to note that damaged hands compromised her usefulness, to calculate the practical impact of her injury on the household's operation. This was the framework she had available. This was how the people who employed her had always understood her body as an instrument of labor whose maintenance was a productivity concern. He set her hand down on the table very gently and went to the cabinet beside the sink where she kept the household medical supplies organized in the manner she had established in her second week. He returned with clean cotton strip, the tin of healing salve, and the small basin she used for washing wounds. He poured water from the kettle into the basin, tested the temperature against his own wrist, and set it on the table beside her. "Give me the other one," he said. She looked at him. He was not looking at her face. He was looking at her hands with that same focused, assessing expression he gave to problems that required solving, and something else, something running underneath the assessment that she could not name, but that felt different from any expression she had been on the receiving end of in a very long time. "Mr. Harrow," she said, and heard her own voice come out smaller than she intended. "I can manage this myself." He looked at her then. "I know you can," he said, and the words were almost exactly what he had said about the fence post, that same flat certainty, but the tone under them was not the same. "Give me the other one, Martha." She gave him her other hand. He washed both of them in the warm water, carefully working around the broken blisters with a gentleness that was astonishing in a man with hands the size of his, the calloused, rough hands of someone who worked with his body every day of his life. He worked in silence, and she sat in silence because there was nothing in her vocabulary for this moment, no prior experience to navigate by. The lamplight was warm. The kitchen was warm. Somewhere upstairs, one of the children turned in their sleep, a creak of a bed frame, and then nothing. He dried her hands with the clean cloth and opened the salve tin and applied the salve to both palms with the careful, methodical attention of a man performing a task he has decided matters. His thumb moved across the damaged skin of her right palm with a slowness that was not inefficiency, but something else entirely, something she was not going to name. When he had wrapped both hands in clean cotton strips, neat and firm, without being tight, he set the supplies aside and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and the silence between them was not comfortable exactly, but it was full in the way that silence between two people is sometimes full of everything that is not being said. "You are not a mule, Martha," he said. His voice was low and even, but something moved behind it, something that had the quality of a statement that has been forming for a while and has finally found the words. "In this house, when you are tired, you rest. When your hands are hurt, you tell someone." She opened her mouth and closed it. The words she would normally have assembled, the deflections, the practical objections, the reflexive minimizing of her own needs, none of them arrived. They had been replaced temporarily by a stillness that was not her trained stillness of self-protection, but something different, something that felt like the moment before a long-held breath releases. "I'm not accustomed to that," she said finally, which was the truest thing she could offer him. "I know," he said. He did not say anything else. He gathered the supplies and returned them to the cabinet with the same deliberate care with which he had retrieved them, and he poured himself the coffee he had come for and took it to the doorway, and he paused there with his back to her for a moment, and she thought he was going to say something more, but he did not. He went upstairs, and she heard his footsteps on the landing, and the long pause and the return, and she sat at the kitchen table with her carefully wrapped hands in her lap, and the mending set aside, and the lamp burning, and she breathed. She did not immediately understand what had shifted. That was the honest account of it. She understood it the way you understand a change in pressure, before a storm felt in the body, before the mind has assembled language for it, a difference in the atmosphere, a difference in the weight of the air. She understood that something had moved in this house. In this kitchen, in the particular quiet between herself and the man who owned the property on which she was employed, and she did not know what to do with that understanding, and so she did what she had learned to do with the things she did not know what to do with. She put it somewhere safe. She went to bed. But in the days that followed, she noticed things she had not been looking for. She noticed that the axe appeared one morning with its handle sanded smooth, the rough spot gone, and no one mentioned it. She noticed that the gap in the porch roof that let the cold in directly over the kitchen door was patched with new wood the week after the night in the barn, quietly between other tasks. She noticed that when she came in from the chicken yard in the early mornings with the egg basket, there was sometimes a second cup of coffee already poured and set on the counter, not always, not reliably enough to be a habit she could count on, but present often enough to be deliberate. She noticed that Ezekiel Harrow, who had previously passed through the kitchen, as if through a space with no particular occupant, had begun to pause in it. Not for long, not in any way that announced itself. Just a moment longer at the window. A question about the supply list asked with more attention than the question required. His eyes, when they crossed hers at the supper table, not moving away quite as quickly as they had in the first weeks. She was very careful with these observations. She treated them like objects of uncertain weight, handling them gently, not pressing on them to see how solid they were. She knew the danger of building interpretation on insufficient evidence. She knew the danger of wanting something to mean more than it meant, especially for a woman who had been told so thoroughly and for so long that certain meanings were not available to her. She held what she had noticed loosely, the way you hold something borrowed, aware that it can be taken back, aware that your grip does not determine ownership. The children, meanwhile, had settled into a new arrangement of their days that centered by degrees on the kitchen and on her. She had not orchestrated this. She would have been suspicious of a plan that required her to win the children's affection, because affection sought is a different thing from affection given, and she was only interested in the second kind. But what happened was not orchestrated, it was organic. The slow gravitational pull of warmth toward cold, of steadiness toward chaos, of someone who shows up every single day without exception toward people for whom consistency has become a source of constant low-level anxiety because it has been so reliably absent. Henry had stopped addressing her as Miss Crowley and begun calling her Miss Martha, which was a small thing that turned out to matter. Eliza had started asking questions in the kitchen. Real questions. How do you know when the bread is ready? Why does the fat render differently in cold weather? What do you do when the baking powder is old? Ruth had begun bringing things to show her a smooth stone from the creek. A feather she found near the fence line, a small dried flower she had pressed between the pages of the hymn book in the parlor. Martha received each offering with the seriousness it deserved and found a window ledge in the kitchen to display them, and Ruth would sometimes come and stand in front of that ledge and look at her collection with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has begun to mark out a small territory of her own. Zeke watched this. Martha knew he watched it with the peripheral awareness she had developed over weeks of living in close quarters with someone who moved carefully and observed without appearing to observe. She did not perform it for him. She was not capable of performance, not in this, not with these 3 children, who had slid past her carefully maintained perimeter and taken up residence in the part of her that she had thought was closed against exactly this kind of occupation. She was sitting with Ruth one evening in the kitchen, the small girl in her lap for the first time having climbed up without warning or permission, in the way of a child who has decided that a person is safe and is simply acting on the decision without announcement. Ruth's hair was finally combed, all the tangles worked out over several patient evenings, and was now braided in the simple style that Martha could manage quickly in the mornings. The child was holding a picture book from the parlor shelf, not reading it, just turning the pages slowly and looking at the illustrations with that steady interior attention she brought to most things, and Martha had one arm loosely around her, because the child had arranged herself to make this necessary, and the other hand was turning the pages of her inventory ledger, calculating the weeks of winter remaining against the current pantry stock. She looked up, and Zeke was in the kitchen doorway. He was not asking for anything. He was not on his way to somewhere. He was simply there, looking at the 2 of them in the lamplight, and the expression on his face was one she had not seen before, and it was not something she had any prior framework for, and she held it at arm's length in her mind, and was careful with it, very careful the way you are careful with fire. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and Ruth turned a page. "Good night, Mr. Harrow," she said, because something needed to be said, and that was the safe thing. "Good night, Martha," he said, and the way he said her name, just the name with no title, the way he had said it the night he had wrapped her hands, was a thing she was going to have to think about later when the kitchen was quiet and the child was asleep, and she was alone with her inventory ledger and her careful, firm, determined understanding of her own situation. He went upstairs. Martha Bell Crowley, who did not cry easily, sat in the warm kitchen with a small sleeping child in her lap and looked at the window that showed nothing but the cold dark outside and the reflection of the lamp, and breathed, and was very still, and did not think about anything she was not supposed to think about. She was mostly successful. December arrived at Black Hollow Ridge with a silence that had weight to it, the particular hush of a landscape receiving snow for the first time in a season, the world muffled and rearranged and made unfamiliar in the way that only deep winter can manage. The first real snowfall came on a Tuesday night, and by Wednesday morning the hollow was buried under 14 inches of white. The fence lines softened to gentle suggestions, the barn roof carrying its load with the patient solidity of good construction, the creek reduced to a murmur beneath its thickened ice. Martha was up before 4 as always, but she stood at the kitchen window for a full minute before lighting the stove, looking at the snow in the pre-dawn dark, the way it held the faint blue light of a sky not yet ready to call itself morning. There was something in it that reached past her careful management of her own interior life, and touched something older and quieter, the part of her that had not yet been entirely convinced by the practical arguments she made to herself each evening. She stood there and looked at the snow and felt briefly, and without permission, something adjacent to peace. Then she lit the stove because the hands would need hot food before they went out into that cold, and the feeling went back to wherever feelings went when Martha Crowley decided they were not useful. The snow changed the rhythm of the ranch in ways both practical and less easily categorized. The cattle required more intensive management hay hauled out to the sheltered areas where the herd had gathered water troughs broken and cleared twice daily, the weaker animals monitored for signs of cold stress. The ranch hands worked longer hours in harder conditions and came in at midday, half frozen, and Martha kept soup on the back of the stove, continuously rotating through the stocks she had built up in the cold cellar with the careful rationing of someone who has done the mathematics of a long winter against a finite pantry. She made hot coffee available at all hours. She kept the kitchen warm enough that a man could thaw his hands against a cup and feel human again inside of 10 minutes. The children were confined to the house and immediate yard for the worst days, which created its own management challenges. Henry's velocity, already considerable in open spaces, became genuinely dangerous indoors during a blizzard. Martha addressed this by giving him jobs. Real jobs, not invented ones, because he was 8 and perfectly capable of detecting condescension. He split kindling in the sheltered lean-to off the back porch, which had the dual benefit of channeling his energy and replenishing the wood supply she went through at an accelerated rate during cold snaps. He carried hay to the 2 orphan lambs that Fletcher had moved into the far stall of the barn, and he reported back to Martha on their progress with the seriousness of a field correspondent, and she listened to every report with the seriousness it deserved. Eliza had begun without discussion or announcement to help Martha with the midday meal, not with the breakfast which Martha had before 5 and managed alone in the quiet she required at that hour, but with the noon meal arriving in the kitchen around 9 with the self-possessed manner of someone reporting for a shift they have decided to take on and require no acknowledgement for having decided. Martha made room for her without comment. She showed her things the same way she had always shown her things, with the patient, specific instruction of someone who considers the transmission of practical knowledge a serious undertaking. She taught Eliza how to manage the temperature of the oven by the color of the flour she sprinkled on the bottom rack. She taught her how to read a stew by its smell the moment when the raw has cooked out of the onions and the real flavor begins to build. She taught her how to make the white sauce that could be applied to almost any protein in the cold cellar and produce something that felt like intention rather than improvisation. Eliza absorbed all of it with the focused intensity of someone who understands at some deep instinctive level that competence is a form of security, that knowing how to do things is a hedge against a world that has already demonstrated its capacity to remove the people you depend on. Martha understood this intimately. She had learned to cook for the same reason. They did not discuss this. They stood side by side at the wide worktop and cooked, and the understanding between them had the particular quality of things communicated without language the way certain important things always are. It was during one of these mornings in the kitchen on a day when the snow had paused, and the light through the window was the clear, brilliant white of a hard frost and a cloudless sky, that Zeke came in mid-morning, which was unusual. He came in from outside, stamping the snow from his boots at the door, and he was pulling his gloves off, and he stopped when he saw the 2 of them at the worktop. Eliza carefully julienning carrots under Martha's quiet supervision, and the stopping was not the pause of a man interrupted. It was the pause of a man who has walked into something he was not expecting, and is for a fraction of a second entirely unguarded. Martha saw it. She was quite sure Eliza did not focus as she was on the carrot and the knife. She registered it and went back to her own work, trimming the salt pork at the far end of the counter. Zeke poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter near the window, not leaving, which was the unusual part. He usually moved through the kitchen with purpose and exited. He stood at the window with his coffee and watched the snow-covered hollow, and after a while he said to no one in particular, "South fence held through the night. Thought we might lose the middle section." "Good," Martha said. "The calves are in the south pasture." "Yes." He drank his coffee. "Rosie had a good night. She's on her feet this morning." This was the calf with scours. Martha had not needed to tend her in 4 days, the animal having rounded the corner she had suspected she would round. She felt a quiet satisfaction at this news that she did not express beyond, "She's a stubborn one, that will serve her." Chos. She heard something that might in another man in another moment have been the beginning of a laugh pulled back before it fully formed. When she glanced over, he was looking at his coffee cup with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was the shadow of where a smile might land if a man had any practice at it. Eliza said without looking up from her carrots, "Uncle Zeke, Miss Martha showed me how to do these properly. You're supposed to cut on the bias, so they cook evenly." There was a small silence. "Is that right?" he said. "It makes a difference," Eliza said, with the conviction of someone who has recently acquired a piece of knowledge and is field-testing its weight. Martha continued trimming the pork and did not look at either of them, but she was aware of Zeke's gaze moving across the kitchen to her and resting there for a moment before he looked back at the window, and the silence that followed was not an uncomfortable one. He finished his coffee, set the cup on the counter with the care he always gave to small physical actions, and pushed off from the window. He was at the door, his hand on his coat, when he paused. "The parlor stove," he said. "The flue's been drawing poorly. I'll look at it today." He said it to the door or to his coat or to the air generally in the way of a man who has decided to do a thing and is informing the room rather than any particular person. "The children's rooms have been cold." "They have," Martha said neutrally. He went out. Eliza watched the door close and then looked at Martha with an expression that was 11 years old and perfectly uncomfortably perceptive. Martha met her gaze with the steady composure she had available and said, "Those carrots want to be thinner." And Eliza returned to her work, but the corner of her mouth had a quality that Martha chose not to examine. The parlor stove was fixed that afternoon. The children's rooms were warmer that evening, which Martha verified by going up to check their blankets after she heard them settle a habit she had not named aloud and did not intend to. Ruth was asleep with her thumb near her mouth, and the extra blanket pulled up to her chin, and Martha stood in the doorway of the small room for a moment and looked at her and felt the familiar, complicated pressure in her chest that she had given up fighting and had begun simply acknowledging the way you acknowledge weather as a condition of the current environment that you did not choose and cannot change. She loved these children. She had arrived at this understanding gradually, and then suddenly in the way of things that have been true for some time before they are recognized. She had not intended to. She had been very specific with herself about not intending to. But intention, she was discovering, had less authority over certain territories of herself than she had previously believed, and the children had found their way into her before she had finished building the argument against it. This was, she knew, a complication. The contract was for 1 year. In less than 7 months, she would be required to leave or to renegotiate, and a renegotiation depended on a number of factors she did not control, and the attachment of a woman in her position to 3 children in the care of their legal guardian was not a thing that came with any guarantees or protections. She knew this. She held it clearly. She did not use it to wall off the feeling because she had tried that already, and it had not worked. But she held it as context, as the frame within which whatever this was could be allowed to exist without her losing sight of its dimensions. She told herself this carefully in her room at night. Bait. The telling was becoming harder to hear over something else that had started up in that same interior space, a quieter and more insistent voice that she did not entirely trust because it was the voice that had been systematically and comprehensively silenced over the course of 30 years, and she had no way of knowing with certainty whether what it was saying was true or whether it was simply the wishful elaboration of a woman who had been lonely for a very long time. What she knew, what she permitted herself to know, was this: Ezekiel Harrow was not the man he appeared to be on the surface. The surface was severe and controlled and defended with the thoroughness of someone who has learned that hope is the precursor to loss, that the things you love are the things that can be taken from you, and that the arithmetic of grief improves if you reduce the number of things you allow yourself to love. She understood this arithmetic. She had done a version of it herself with different variables, but the same basic logic. Under the surface, she had begun to see the other things. The nightly check on the children that he did not know she knew about. The axe handle sanded in the dark. The coffee poured and left. The parlor stove fixed without being asked. The way he had held her hands in the lamplight carefully, as if they were something that mattered, as if she were something that mattered, which was a sentence she was still not entirely certain she was allowed to finish. He had begun to seek her out in the small ways available to a man who would not permit himself to seek anyone out directly. He would find reasons to be in the kitchen when she was there. Practical reasons, always with some legitimate purpose in hand, but the legitimate purpose had the quality of a pretext thin enough to see through if you were paying attention and honest enough that neither of them was required to acknowledge it. He asked her opinion on ranch decisions with a frequency that exceeded what her role or her expertise strictly warranted. He had started telling her things, small things, a report on one of the horses, a problem with the south fence line. Something Fletcher had said about the spring cattle drive offered not as information she required, but as the verbal equivalent of presence, the way people share things with people they have begun to consider present in their lives. One evening in the middle of December, when the children were asleep, and the hens were in the bunkhouse and the house was quiet, in the deep particular way of a winter night, with snow on the ground, he came into the kitchen, and instead of coffee, he sat down at the table. He had never sat down at the kitchen table before, not in her presence, not without the excuse of a meal. She was at the worktop preparing tomorrow's bread dough, because the long rise required it to begin the night before. She did not stop what she was doing. She kept her hands in the dough and her eyes on the work. He was quiet for a while. She heard the sound of him turning something over in his hands, some small object, a sound she could not identify. "I want to tell you something," he said. Her hands kept moving. "All right," she said. Another silence, not the silence of a man who has nothing to say, but the silence of a man assembling the words for something he has not said before. "My wife," he said. "Her name was Clara. She died in the winter of '81. We had a bad storm early before we were provisioned for it. She went out for water, and she went through the ice." He stopped. "I was in the lower pasture. I didn't know until it was too late." Martha's hands were still in the dough. She did not turn around. She understood that some things are easier to say to someone's back, that the absence of a face to witness the telling sometimes allows the words to come out that would otherwise stay locked. "I am sorry," she said quietly. "My brother Daniel," he continued, "came to stay the following spring. He wanted to help me rebuild. He was that kind of man." Another pause. "The fire started in the kitchen. I was in the barn. By the time I got to the house, the roof was already gone." His voice was flat and level, the flatness of a man who has practiced this particular account into something he can say without breaking, but the control itself was a kind of telling. "I got the children out. I couldn't get Daniel and Marie." The kitchen was very quiet. "People say the ranch is cursed," he said. "I know what they mean by it. I've thought it myself." Martha turned around then because something in the last sentence required her to. She wiped her hands on her apron and turned and looked at him. He was sitting with his forearms on the table, his hands flat against the wood, looking at them in the way of someone examining evidence. He was not looking at her. "A curse and a wound are two different things," she said. He looked up. She held his gaze with the steadiness she had, which was considerable. "A curse is something done to you from the outside. A wound is something that happened to you. You don't carry responsibility for either one of them, Mr. Harrow, but only the wound can heal." He looked at her for a long moment, with an expression she could not entirely read something in it that was not simple and was not comfortable and was not something she had a name for. "You lost people too," he said. It was not a question. "My mother when I was 4, she said. "My father in September, though I had lost parts of him long before that." She paused. "And other things, less concrete. The kind of losses that don't come with funerals." He was quiet. Then, the stepmother. "Among others," she said without bitterness, just the plain statement of a fact she had made her accommodation with. He nodded slowly, not as acknowledgment of something minor, but as the nod of someone receiving information they intend to keep. Then he stood, because he had done the thing he came to do, which was to say the unsayable thing, and to hear the response, and now the evening required him to go back to his solitude, and she to her bread dough. But at the door he turned and looked at her again, and there was something different in it, something that had changed in the past 10 minutes, a fractional shift in the geography between them, as if the map had been redrawn very slightly to include a territory that had not previously been acknowledged. "Martha," he said. "Yes," she said. He seemed to consider and then let go of whatever he had been about to say, substituting instead something smaller and safer. "The bread. Don't do the whole batch tonight. Rest when you're tired." She looked at him. "You said that before." "I meant it before," he said. "I mean it now." He went upstairs. She stood in the kitchen with her hands in the bread dough, and she breathed, and the warm kitchen breathed around her, and the house made its small winter sounds, and she was in that moment very aware of being alive, of being in this specific kitchen, in this specific life that was not the life she had planned, and not the life anyone had intended for her, and not the life she had told herself to be content with, which was a smaller and more contained thing than this was turning into. And she did not know what to do with any of it, and she was terrified, and she was more present in her own body than she had been in years. And these two facts coexisted with the full, complicated weight of things that have no simple resolution. She made the bread dough. She rested when she was done. Christmas came to Black Hollow Ridge in the way that Christmas comes to working ranches, which is to say it arrived in the middle of everything else that needed doing and had to find its space in the margins. Martha had been thinking about it for 3 weeks, because she had observed that no preparations were being made, no acknowledgement of its approach, and she suspected this was because the adults in the household were people for whom the preceding 2 Christmases had been attended by grief sufficient to drain the occasion of its ordinary connotations. She did not make a production of it. She simply quietly did the small things she could do. She made paper chains with Henry one afternoon when the snow trapped them inside, letting him believe it was a project she had invented to occupy him, watching him cut and paste with the intense concentration of a boy who has channeled all his velocity into a task he has decided is important. She made a small wreath for the kitchen door from the pine boughs she had brought in for fragrance. She made a fruit cake from the dried fruit in the pantry, the recipe her mother had apparently once kept rendered to Martha via a very old woman in Caldwell Flats, who had known her mother and shared it with Martha once years ago, for reasons Martha had never been entirely sure of, perhaps simply because someone had recognized in the girl's eyes that she was hungry for something that had nothing to do with food. On the morning of Christmas Eve, she found Zeke in the yard with an axe cutting a small pine from the tree line at the edge of the south pasture. He was working alone in the early light, and he had the tree down and trimmed before she had finished watching from the kitchen window, and he carried it back to the house in the way he carried most things, with a wordless, focused intention that made it look like the most natural thing in the world. He brought it into the parlor and set it in the corner by the window, and when Martha appeared in the doorway with the paper chains that Henry had made, Zeke took them from her hands without ceremony and stood on the chair and wound them around the upper branches with the same thoroughness he applied to repairing fence posts. "Henry made those," she said. "I know," he said from the chair. "He told me about them in considerable detail." She felt the thing in her chest again, the inconvenient, complicated, warm thing, and she was done arguing with it. She stood there with her hands clasped loosely in front of her and watched Ezekiel Harrow put his nephew's paper chains on a Christmas tree, in the room where his family had stopped gathering, and she was aware with a clarity that was not comfortable, and was not simple, and was not going away, that she was watching a man begin in the smallest possible way to come back to something. The children came down that evening to the decorated parlor and stood in the doorway together, the three of them in a row, and the expressions on their faces were the expressions of people receiving something they had stopped expecting. Henry's face broke open with uncomplicated joy. Eliza's face did the thing Martha had learned to watch for, the fractional loosening of the held tension in her shoulders, the specific relaxation of someone whose vigilance has been for a moment unrequired. Ruth looked at the tree for a long time in silence, and then she looked at Martha, and she said with the precise clarity she brought to all her rare utterances, "It's beautiful." "It is," Martha said. Zeke was standing beside Martha in the doorway, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him, the solid physical reality of a large man standing near her in a way that was not accidental and was not being acknowledged by either of them. He did not move away. She did not move away. They stood there together in the doorway and watched the three children move into the room toward the tree, and the lamplight made the paper chains glow gold, and the pine smell like something that existed before grief. And Ruth reached out one small, careful hand and touched a branch, and Henry was already talking, explaining something to Eliza about the chains, his specific contribution to each link, and Eliza was listening with the patient attention she gave to things she loved, and the parlor at Black Hollow Ridge was full in a way it had not been full for a very long time. Martha felt Zeke's hand then, not taking hers, not reaching for it, just his hand beside hers in the doorway, the backs of their fingers touching barely the lightest possible contact, the kind that can be denied or acknowledged at a person's choice. And she made her choice, and she turned her hand just slightly so that her fingers rested against his, and he did not move away. And they stood there like that for a moment that had no other name for itself except what it was, and neither of them said anything because nothing needed to be said. It was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. It was more than Martha Bell Crowley had permitted herself to hope for in a very long time. And she stood with the warmth of his hand against hers, and the sounds of three children rediscovering something they had thought was lost. And she let herself be present in it without argument, without qualification, without the practical voice reminding her of the contract and the 7 months and the uncertain future. Just for that moment in the lamplight on Christmas Eve, she let it be what it was. She did not know that the thing she was most afraid of was already making its way toward Black Hollow Ridge from the West Road, wrapped in wool and vindictiveness, carrying legal documents and old grievances and the particular cruelty of people who have never forgiven others for surviving them. She did not know that the warmth she had found so carefully, so slowly, at such cost to her own careful defenses, was about to be tested in a way that would require more from her than anything she had yet been asked to give. She stood in the doorway with Ezekiel Harrow and watched her children, and she did not know any of that yet. She was happy, quietly, completely, terrifyingly happy, for the first time in longer than she could name. They came on the 2nd day of January, when the new year was still raw, and the snow on the road to Black Hollow Ridge had been packed hard by the cold into something that looked like permanence. Martha was in the kitchen when she heard the wagon. She heard it, before she saw it, the particular creak and rattle of a hired conveyance moving too fast for winter road conditions, driven by someone more interested in arrival than in the safety of the journey. She wiped her hands on her apron and went to the kitchen window, and what she saw in the yard below erased the quiet of the preceding weeks with the efficiency of a cold wind finding an unlatched door. Vivian Crowley descended from the wagon with the precise movements of a woman who has rehearsed her entrance. She was dressed well better than Martha remembered, in a dark green traveling coat with fur at the collar that suggested either improved finances or calculated performance, and Martha suspected the latter. Behind her came a man Martha did not recognize, thin and carefully dressed, carrying a leather document case with the proprietary manner of someone whose power resides in paper. He had the particular face of a lawyer in a frontier town, a face that had learned to arrange itself into an expression of professional neutrality, while the eyes behind it calculated continuously. Martha stood at the kitchen window and felt the happiness of the preceding weeks recede with the swift certainty of a tide going out, leaving the shore exposed. She went to the front door before they knocked. Vivian looked at her with the expression she had always reserved for Martha, the one that contained within it the entire history of what she believed Martha to be, a sum so fixed and so unfavorable that no evidence could revise it. She looked her up and down, once taking inventory, and whatever she found confirmed her prior position, because the expression did not change. "Martha," she said, "you look well enough. The country air suits you, apparently." "Mrs. Crowley," Martha said, "this is a working ranch. If you have business here, state it." The thin lawyer cleared his throat. "My name is Aldous Crane, representing the estate of the late Thomas Crowley and certain associated creditors. I need to speak with you, and I am given to understand the proprietor of this property." "On what matter?" Martha said. "A matter of some considerable legal significance," Crane said, "pertaining to a trust instrument established by your maternal grandmother, held in abeyance pending certain conditions, which conditions have now become relevant." Martha looked at him for a moment. She looked at Vivian, who was watching her with the careful attention of someone waiting for a performance they have already choreographed in their mind. "Come in," Martha said, because the cold was considerable, and because she needed to hear what they had to say before she could determine what to do about it, and because she had learned long ago that the thing coming toward you is better faced than avoided. She put them in the parlor. She did not offer coffee. She went to find Zeke. He was in the barn with Cal, working on the axle of the supply wagon, which had developed a problem in the last cold snap. He looked up when she appeared in the barn doorway, and something in her face, some quality of stillness that was not her ordinary stillness, made him put down the tool in his hand and come toward her without being asked. "There are people in the parlor," she said quietly so Cal would not hear. "A lawyer named Crane, and my stepmother." His eyes were on her face. "Why?" he said. "Something about my mother's family. A trust of some kind. I didn't know it existed." She paused. "I am sorry to bring this into your house." "It's not your fault," he said, with the flat certainty of a man who has already determined this without deliberation. They went in together. The parlor had the feeling of a space that had been recently rearranged by the occupants to suit their purposes. Crane's document case open on the small writing table, papers arranged with the practiced precision of a man who understands that visual authority over paperwork is a form of power. Vivian was seated in the better chair, the velvet one by the window, which Martha noted with the automatic attention she gave to things people chose when they had choices, and what it told her about how they saw themselves in a room. Zeke stood at the edge of the parlor with his arms at his sides and his face in the expression that Martha had learned to read as contained attention, the look of a man who is listening very carefully and revealing nothing. Crane laid out the matter with professional efficiency. Martha's maternal grandmother, a woman named Edith Morris, had been a woman of modest but real property in the county to the east. Upon her death she had established through a lawyer of her own, a man long since deceased, a trust in favor of her only grandchild, Martha Bell Crowley. The trust comprised a deed to a parcel of 40 acres with a small farmhouse and water rights to the creek that ran through its eastern boundary along with a sum of money that had been accumulating modest interest for the better part of a decade. The conditions of transfer were specific. The trust became Martha's property outright at her 30th birthday, which had passed in September, or upon her marriage, whichever came first. Martha listened to all of this with a surface that did not move. She had not known. She had genuinely not known. The grandmother, who had apparently done this quiet act of love from beyond the reach of Vivienne's influence, was a woman she had met perhaps 4 times as a small child. A large, quiet woman who had smelled of lavender and had given Martha peppermints from her coat pocket without making a fuss about it. She had died when Martha was 12. Martha had not been told about the trust. She understood, looking at Vivienne's face across the parlor, why she had not been told. The trust transferred automatically in September. Crane said upon Miss Crowley's 30th birthday, the property and the funds are legally hers unencumbered. However, he paused in the particular way of lawyers who pause to indicate that the pause contains the real content of the meeting. The estate of Thomas Crowley carries substantial debts. Creditors have a claim, and there is a question of whether certain administrative fees accrued during the years the trust was held, fees paid by Mrs. Vivienne Crowley on behalf of the estate, constitute a legal lien against the trust assets. Martha looked at Vivienne. "Do they?" she said. "That is a matter for the courts to determine," Crane said smoothly. "And what brings you here?" Zeke said. It was the first time he had spoken, and the flatness of it, the absolute economy of it, made Crane look at him with a reassessment that was slight but visible. "We thought it prudent to discuss the matter directly," Crane said, before pursuing legal remedies. Miss Crowley's cooperation in acknowledging the lien would considerably simplify the process. Her cooperation, Zeke said, a voluntary acknowledgement. Crane said that a portion of the trust assets, a reasonable portion, be directed toward the settlement of the estate debts, in exchange for which the remaining claims against her would be released and she would receive clear title to the remainder. Zeke looked at Martha. She met his gaze. She could see him calculating not the money. She did not think it was the money, but something about the shape of the situation, the topology of it, who was owed what, and by whom, and what the debt actually was. "I need to speak with Mr. Harrow privately," Martha said. Vivienne's mouth moved in something that was not a smile. "Of course you do," she said. They went to the kitchen. It was the room of the house that was most fully Martha's, and this occurred to her as they stood in it, the kitchen she had blacked and stocked and heated and made into the center of a living household, and the thought had a complicated weight to it that she set aside. "You don't have to cooperate with any of this," Zeke said. "If the trust transferred legally in September, it's yours. The lien claim is questionable." "I know," she said, "but a legal fight costs money I don't yet have access to, and Crane knows that. The offer is meant to look like the practical choice." Zeke was quiet for a moment. "Then the property, the 40 acres. Do you know where it is?" He said the county to the east. Millhaven County, I think. "Good land over there," he said neutrally. "Yes," she said, and there was a silence that had a great deal of content in it. She understood what he was not saying, or thought she did. The 40 acres and the money represented something her situation had not previously contained, which was an alternative. An exit. A life that was not this life, not this contract, not this ranch, that would require her to leave in 7 months regardless. She was no longer a woman with nowhere to go. She was a woman with property, which was a different category of person entirely, and they both knew it. She thought of Vivienne's original words, the ones delivered to the back of her head at the threshold of the Caldwell Flats house. "It's not as if any man would ever choose to marry a creature like you." She thought of them now because they were relevant in a way she had not anticipated when she first filed them away. Relevant because the thing that had been growing in this kitchen and this parlor and this barn over the past 3 months was the thing that sentence had been designed to preemptively destroy, and it had not been destroyed. It had grown anyway, quietly and stubbornly, the way certain plants grow in unlikely conditions, and now there was property and an inheritance involved. And she did not know. She could not know with certainty how those facts intersected with the other thing. She trusted Zeke. She had come to trust him the way you come to trust the ground under your feet, after walking on it long enough without it failing, not with blindness, but with the earned confidence of accumulated evidence. But she was also a woman who had spent 30 years being told what she was and was not worth, and the voice that delivered those verdicts had not been entirely silenced by 3 months of quiet kindnesses and one brief touch of hands in a lamplight doorway, and it spoke to her now in the kitchen with its old precision. "He has been good to you," the voice said, "because you are useful and his children love you. Now you have property. Now the equation has changed. Now you will discover which parts of this were about you and which parts were about his need." She knew this voice. She had lived with it for 30 years. She knew it was not always wrong. She went back to the parlor. She told Crane she would consult a lawyer of her own choosing before signing any document. Crane's expression indicated that this was not the outcome he had planned for, and Vivian's stillness had the quality of suppressed frustration held under tight control. "You are being unwise," Vivian said. "The legal costs alone." "I'll manage," Martha said. It was what she had said on the porch in Caldwell Flats the morning she left, and she said it now with the same quiet finality. They arranged to return in a fortnight, and they left, and the wagon went back down the road to the packed snow, and Martha stood at the kitchen window and watched it go. Zeke came to stand beside her. "You handled that correctly," he said. "They'll come back," she said. "Crane has more in that case than he showed us." "Probably, he said. He was looking at the road. "The land in Millhaven. You should go see it, when the roads are passable." Something tightened in her chest. "Yes," she said. "It might be a good property," he said. The flatness of his voice was back the controlled economy that she had learned to read, and right now she could not read it. "With your grandmother's money to work it." "Mr. Harrow," she said. He looked at her. She wanted to ask him something. She could feel the question in her assembled and ready, but she could not determine whether asking it was courage or foolishness, and she stood there with it for a moment too long, and the moment passed, and she said instead, "Thank you for being in the room." He nodded once and went back out to the barn. She stood in the kitchen, and the warmth of it was the same warmth it had been that morning and the morning before, and the bread dough was rising under its cloth on the counter, and the soup was on the back of the stove, and the paper chains were still on the Christmas tree. In the parlor, and everything was the same, and nothing was the same. And she was very tired in a way that was not about the work. Vivian came back alone 3 days later. Not with Crane. Alone in the early afternoon when Zeke was at the far end of the south pasture and the children were in the house and Cal was in the barn. She came quietly, which was not Vivian's habit, and which therefore told Martha something, and she knocked at the kitchen door rather than the front, which told her something else. Martha let her in because she had no grounds to do otherwise, and because she wanted to know what Vivian wanted badly enough to say it without Crane present. Vivian sat at the kitchen table, which she had never done in any house they had shared together, and she looked around the kitchen with the particular attention of a woman assessing someone else's domain, and whatever she assessed seemed to both satisfy and frustrate her simultaneously. "You've done well here," she said, and the words had the quality of something extracted from a difficult place. "I've done my work," Martha said. "The rancher," Vivian said. "What is he to you?" Martha put the kettle on because she needed something to do with her hands. "My employer," she said. "Don't be disingenuous," Vivian said. "I saw the way he stood in that room." Martha was quiet. Vivian leaned forward slightly, and her voice dropped to the tone Martha knew best, the intimate poison of a woman who delivers her cruelty as concern. "Martha, I am going to say something to you because whatever our history, I was married to your father, and I am not without some feeling for your situation." She paused for precisely the right dramatic interval. "Do you honestly believe that man loves you? Look at this clearly. You arrived here with nothing. You cooked his food and raised his children and ran his failing house. And now you have property and money. Can you truly not see what you represent to him? A desperate solution, a capable woman willing to work herself to the bone for almost nothing, and now potentially a financial advantage." Martha set the kettle on the stove. "You are a fat, desperate spinster," Vivian said with the calm of someone delivering established fact. "And he is using you. That is what this is. Men like him do not fall in love with women like you. That is simply the truth of the world, and you have been here long enough in this beautiful kitchen playing house with these sad children that you have forgotten what the world actually thinks of you." Martha stood at the stove with her back to Vivian. She could feel every word. That was the honest account of it. She could feel each one with the specific precision of a wound that has been reopened in exactly the same place, because Vivian knew with the terrible accuracy of someone who has spent years cataloging another person's vulnerabilities exactly where to put the blade and exactly how deep to push it. Martha had thought herself past this. She had thought in the stupid warmth of the preceding weeks that she had outgrown the reach of it. She had not. She turned around. "Get out of my kitchen," she said. Her voice was level. There was a precision to it that was not anger, or not only anger, but something older and more definite. The voice of a woman who has made a decision and is informing the room. Vivian blinked. She had not expected this. "Get out," Martha said again, still level, still precise. "You will deal with Mr. Harrow's lawyer on the matter of the trust, and you will not come to this house again without Crane. And you will not speak to me in that manner in my kitchen or anywhere else." Vivian stood slowly, and her face had the quality of a woman recalibrating. She picked up her coat. She looked at Martha with an expression that was not quite what Martha expected, not triumph, not contempt, but something more complicated, the expression of a woman who has thrown a stone and is not entirely certain of the outcome. At the door she paused. "I hope you know what you're doing," she said. "I do," Martha said. And Vivian left. Martha stood in the kitchen alone, and then she sat down at the table in the chair Vivian had just vacated, and she put her hands flat on the wood, the way Zeke had put his hands flat on the table on the night he had told her about Clara and the ice and the fire, and she breathed. The words were in her. She could not pretend they were not. She had slapped them away, she had expelled their source from the room, but the words themselves had found the places they were designed to find, and settled there with the persistence of things designed for exactly this occupation. She sat with them and did not fight them, because fighting them gave them more substance, and instead, she tried to do what she had learned to do over 30 years of surviving Vivian's particular brand of warfare, which was to hold the words and the truth in the same hand simultaneously and determine which was heavier. The truth was what she had observed, not what she had hoped, not what she had constructed from longing, what she had actually seen. The fence post sanded in the dark, the coffee on the counter, the way he had held her hands, the night in the parlor, with the tree and the paper chains, their fingers touching in the doorway. The night he had told her about Clara, not as an act of processing, but as an act of offering the way you offer something to a person you trust with it. The truth was also what Vivian had said. She could not dismiss it entirely. She did not have certainty. She had not been given certainty. She had been given small acts and one brief moment and 3 months of a changed atmosphere. And she was a woman who had been wrong about the weight of small acts before, who had assigned meaning to things that turned out to be simply the neutral behavior of people acting in their own interest. She did not know. She could not know. And the not knowing in the aftermath of Vivian's words had a weight that she could feel in her body, a heaviness in the chest, a difficulty breathing the specific physical signature of her deepest fear, which was not poverty or loneliness or the cold or even death, but the fear of having believed in something that was not real, of having allowed herself to be seen, wanting the thing she was not allowed to want, and being shown kindly or unkindly that she had been wrong to want it. She heard Zeke come back from the south pasture. She heard his boots on the porch, the stamp of snow, the door of the mudroom. She heard him moving through the house toward the kitchen, the familiar footstep she knew by its weight and its rhythm, the way she knew the sounds of the children at their various activities. He came into the kitchen and stopped. She was still at the table. She had not moved. She became aware in the moment he stopped that her face had not been managed as carefully as she normally managed it, that whatever was in it was visible in a way she would not ordinarily have permitted. He stood there and looked at her, and something moved across his face, swift and specific. "What happened?" he said. "My stepmother came back," she said, "alone." He came and sat down not across from her, but at the corner of the table, close in the way he had begun to arrange himself near her over the past weeks in proximity that was deliberate, without being announced. "What did she say?" he said. Martha looked at him. She looked at him with the full directness that she had, which was considerable, and she said quietly, "She said you were using me, that you do not feel what I have allowed myself to think you might feel, that men like you do not feel that way about women like me." She said it plainly because she was done being indirect about the things that mattered, because Vivian's visit had stripped away the comfortable ambiguity that she had been living in, and she found she could not put it back, did not want to put it back, was too tired and too afraid and too honest to pretend she did not want the answer to the question she had been refusing to ask. Zeke was very still. She watched his face. She watched him receive what she had said, and she watched him sit with it, and she watched the stillness of him, and she did not look away, because she had earned the right to look directly at the thing that frightened her most. He looked at his hands on the table. He looked at them for a long time, the way he had looked at them on the night he told her about Clara, and she waited, and the kitchen was quiet, and outside the winter light was going the brief, pale afternoon of January, retreating early into dark. When he looked up, his face had the quality she had seen in the doorway on Christmas Eve, the unguarded quality, the face of a man whose defenses have been made by circumstance temporarily impossible to maintain. "Martha," he said. "Yes," she said, "I have been afraid." He said with the flat and careful honesty of a man who does not say this kind of thing and is saying it anyway, to want anything, for a long time. "Because I am convinced at a level I cannot argue with that the things I want are the things that get taken, that the people I love are the people who do not survive being loved by me." She was very still. "That is not a rational belief," he said. "I know it is not rational, but it is in me, and I cannot speak about what I feel without speaking about it first, because it is the reason I have been." He stopped. "Less than I should have been." "You have not been less," she said, because this was true, and she would not let it stand uncorrected. "I have not been honest," he said, "about the fact that you are not an employee to me, that you have not been just an employee to me for some time, that this house is what it is because of you, and that is not a thing I say to explain your labor. I say it because." He stopped again, and she could see the effort of it, the effort of a man making himself say the thing that his fear has been bracing against since before she arrived. "Because I cannot imagine it without you in it. Because when I hear your voice in the kitchen in the morning, before I am even awake enough to have made any decisions about anything, I am already." He stopped. The kitchen was entirely quiet. "Already what?" she said very softly. He looked at her. "Glad," he said. "I am already glad." She sat with this word. It was a plain word. It was not a word out of a novel. It was the word of a man who meant it more completely than any elaborate declaration, because it was the word that had slipped past his defenses before he could select something safer. She reached across the corner of the table and put her hand over his the way he had covered hers in the lamplight weeks ago, her broad, strong hand over his large, scarred one. And she felt him go absolutely still under the contact, the stillness of something that has been braced and has not been broken, but has been unexpectedly held. "She is wrong," Martha said. "My stepmother. She has always been wrong about what I am worth. I know that. I have known it in the part of me that she never managed to reach all my life." She paused, "But I needed to hear your answer. Not for her, for me." "You have it," he said. "You have it." And then, because the afternoon was going dark and the soup needed attention and Henry was going to come through that door at any moment with a report on the orphan lambs, she squeezed his hand once and stood and went to the stove, and he sat at the kitchen table and watched her with the expression she had been trying to name for 3 months and could now name without difficulty. And she let herself be watched, and the kitchen was warm, and for a brief, suspended moment, everything was exactly as it should have been. She did not know that Silas Thorne had been in the yard when Vivian arrived, and had stayed in the shadow of the barn long enough to hear the parlor window conversation about the trust. She did not know that Thorne, who had wanted Harrow land for 3 years and had waited with the patience of a patient and dangerous man, had finally found the leverage he had been looking for. She did not know that the night that would test everything was already being planned in a house on the other side of the ridge, where a desperate woman and a greedy man were discovering that their separate needs could be met by a single act. She stood at the stove and stirred the soup. Outside, the January dark came down full, and the stars were very bright in the cold sky above Black Hollow Ridge, the way stars are always brightest in the coldest air, as if the cold burns away everything that obscures them and leaves only the essential light. The night it happened was a Thursday deep in January, when the cold had reached the particular severity that makes the air itself feel hostile, the kind of cold that turns breath to ice before it clears a man's face and freezes the water in the barn troughs overnight, regardless of how well they are insulated. Martha had banked the kitchen stove carefully before bed, the way she always did in the hard cold, leaving enough live coal to keep the pipes from freezing and the kitchen from dropping to dangerous temperatures before she rose at 4 to rebuild it. She had checked on the children, Ruth and Henry both buried deep in their blankets, Eliza sleeping on her side, with one hand tucked under her cheek, in the posture of a girl who had finally gradually learned to sleep without guarding herself. She had gone to her own room and lain down in the dark and listened to the house settle around her, the familiar language of timber contracting in the cold, and she had fallen asleep, thinking of nothing more complicated than the bread she intended to make in the morning, and whether the temperature would break enough by afternoon to allow Cal to make the supply run to town that had been delayed twice already by weather. She woke to the smell of smoke. Not the smoke of the kitchen stove, which was a smell she knew with her whole body integrated into her sleep. The way all familiar smells are below the threshold of alarm. This was different. This was the sharp, resinous smell of something burning that should not be burning. The smell that bypasses the reasoning mind entirely and goes directly to the oldest part of the brain, the part that has known since before language what fire means when it comes in the night. She was on her feet before she was fully conscious. She went to the window first because the window faced the yard, and what she saw stopped her breath for 1 single second before it unlocked into action. The barn was on fire, not beginning to burn, not smoldering toward ignition, but burning with the full committed fury of a structure that has been burning long enough to be beyond the question of whether it will take. The west wall was a sheet of orange light. The roofline was already compromised. She could see the glow pushing through the gaps in the boarding, and the smoke was a black column against the January stars, straight up in the cold, still air, visible for miles. She ran. She did not stop for her coat. She ran through the kitchen and out the back door and into the cold that hit her like a wall and across the yard toward the barn, screaming for the hands, before she had consciously decided to scream the sound tearing out of her throat with the raw urgency of someone who understands that seconds are the only currency available in a burning building. Lights came on in the bunkhouse. She heard voices. She heard Cal shouting. She heard from above her in the house the sound of a window opening and Eliza's voice, high and controlled even now, calling down to her. "Martha, what is it? Stay in the house," Martha shouted back without breaking stride. "Keep the little ones inside. Do not come out, Eliza." The barn doors were on the east side away from the worst of the fire, and they were still operable. She could see that as she reached them, the latch not yet too hot to touch, though the wood of the door was warm under her hands in a way that wood should never be warm in January. She got the latch, she got the door, and the smoke rolled out at her in a wave. And the heat was a physical force, and she went in anyway, because the horses were in there, and she could hear them, the terrible specific screaming of horses who understand fire in the most primal possible way, and are losing their minds with it. The interior was chaos. Smoke and orange light and the crashing of hooves against stall walls, and the roaring of the fire moving along the west wall with a speed that was obscene. She went for the nearest stall, got the latch, slapped the horse on the flank, and it bolted past her into the yard, and she went to the next, and the next, moving fast, holding her breath in the worst of the smoke, her eyes streaming, navigating by feel and by the sounds of the panicking animals. She was at the fourth stall when she heard Zeke. He had come in from the other end, from the small side door near the tack room, and she could hear him working the far stalls, his voice low and forceful, talking to the horses, the way he always talked to them, the particular cadence of it, steady under conditions where nothing was steady. She called to him through the smoke. "Zeke, I have the east side." "I have the west," he called back. "Get out when you have them." "Martha." "When you have them," she said, and went back to work. They got 6 of the 7 horses out. The 7th, a young gelding named Pitch, who was the most afraid, had backed himself into the corner of his stall and was beyond rational response, his eyes white-rimmed, his body pressed against the back wall in the way of an animal that has chosen a fixed point over uncertain motion. Zeke was in the stall with him when the beam came down. Martha heard it before she saw it, the crack of compromised timber giving way above the west wall, and then the sound of impact and Zeke's voice cutting off, and then nothing from his direction, and she was moving toward him before the sound had finished through smoke so thick she was navigating entirely by memory of the barn's layout and the feel of the floor under her bare feet. She found him by his boots. He was on one knee in the stall, partly beneath the fallen beam. Not pinned by it. The beam had glanced rather than struck squarely, but the impact had taken him down, and the smoke was thicker here than anywhere, and she could see from the way he was holding himself that something had been hit hard. He had one hand against the stall wall and was pushing himself upright and failing. "Zeke," she said. He looked up at her through the smoke. His face was black with it, and his eyes were streaming, and he said with the specific clarity of a man who is hurt and is refusing the implications of being hurt, "I am all right." "You are not all right," she said. "Get up." "Pitch," he said. "Pitch is going to have to make his own decision. she said, because the gelding had bolted past them both in the moment of the crash, self-preservation overriding paralysis, as it sometimes does, and was gone into the yard. "Get up." He got up. She put her shoulder under his arm, and he was heavy, and she was solid, and this was the arithmetic of the situation, and she did not waste time thinking about it. She moved him toward the east doors, which were still the better exit, and he moved with her, not leaning entirely, but not pretending he did not need the support either, and the roof above the west wall made a sound like the beginning of the end of something, and she felt the heat on the back of her neck increase dramatically. She got him through the door. The cold air outside was a shock after the heat, and they both went down onto their knees in the snow a dozen yards from the barn, and she could hear the hands working behind her with the water pump and the buckets, the inadequate and determined response of men who know they cannot save the building but are refusing to let the fire spread to the house. She could hear Cal's voice organizing them steady and authoritative, and Fletcher's, and she was aware of the children on the porch of the house, Eliza holding Ruth tight against her side, and Henry pressed against the porch rail, all three of them watching, and she registered that they were there and were whole, and she would get to them in a moment, but first she needed to know what was wrong with Zeke. He was kneeling in the snow with his head down and his hands braced against his knees, and he was breathing the effortful, controlled breathing of someone managing pain, and when she put her hands on his face and turned it toward her, she could see the cut along his temple where the beam had caught him, not deep but bleeding freely, the way head wounds do, and the way he was holding his left shoulder told her something there had taken a hard impact. He looked at her. He looked at her face, not at the barn, not at the yard, at her face, and the expression on his she could not describe, except that it was the expression she had seen twice before, and recognized now for what it was, the expression of a man who has been reached somewhere that he had sealed off and has stopped being afraid that he was reached there. "Martha," he said. "I am here," she said. "The children," he said. "On the porch, all three. I can see them." She kept her hands on his face, partly to look at the cut, partly because she needed to. "You are going to be all right. The cut is not deep." He reached up and put his hand over hers, the way she had put her hand over his at the kitchen table, his large scarred hand over hers, and held it against his face for a moment, and she felt the tremor in him that was not cold and was not weakness, but was the body's honest response to fear that has been held through the event and is now on the other side of it, releasing. It was at this moment that she heard the second voice from the edge of the yard. She looked up. In the orange light of the burning barn, she could see two figures near the yard fence, and she recognized both of them with a clarity that cut through the confusion of the night like something cold and specific. Vivian standing with her arms wrapped around herself, watching the fire, with an expression that was not the expression of someone who has arrived to help. And beside her a man she had not seen before, but whose presence here, now in the middle of the night, told her everything she needed to know. Silas Thorne was a large man with the build of someone who had done physical work for many years and had since moved into the management of people who did physical work for him. He was watching the barn burn with the specific quality of attention of someone watching an investment perform as intended. Martha stood up. "Stay here," she said to Zeke, and her voice had a quality that she had not heard in it before, or not in this combination, the steadiness she always had, and something beneath it, something that had been compressed and heated by the events of the past hour into a different substance entirely. She walked across the yard toward the two figures at the fence, barefoot in the snow in her night clothes, with the smell of smoke in her hair and the cut on her palm, reopened from the stall latches, and she walked, the way she walked when she was carrying something heavy, the way her body carried weight which was from the center without apology, with the full authority of her size and her solidity and everything she was. Thorne saw her coming. He misjudged what it meant, because men like Thorne generally misjudged women who looked like Martha, and he arranged his face into the expression of a man about to be spoken to by someone he does not consider significant. She stopped 2 feet from him. "You set this fire," she said. Thorn opened his mouth. "Do not," she said. "There is a man bleeding in my yard, and 3 children on that porch watching their uncle's barn burn, and I have no patience left for anything except the truth. You set this fire." "Miss Crowley, I don't know what you think you're insinuating," Thorn said with the smooth denial of a man who has denied things before, but something in his voice had acquired a quality it had not had a moment ago, a slight adjustment of register, because she was not behaving as he had anticipated, and men like Thorn are destabilized by the failure of their anticipated scripts. "I heard you from the barn," said a voice behind her. She turned. Fletcher had come up behind her, the old hand with the gray beard holding a lantern, and his face in its light was the face of a man who is done with being careful about what he says. "I was on the south side with the pump when this one," he nodded at Thorn, "came across from the ridge trail. I heard him talking to the woman. He said, 'Let it go to the timbers, and then we go in for the girl.'" Vivian made a sound. Martha turned and looked at her stepmother, and the look she gave her was not what Vivian had expected either, because it was not anger, not the specific personal anger that Vivian had always been able to manage and turn to her advantage. It was something more distant and more final, the look of a woman who is closing an account, settling a last balance, and walking away from the institution. "You brought him here," Martha said. "I did not tell him to do this," Vivian said, and her voice for the first time had a quality Martha had never heard in it, the quality of someone who has gone further than they intended and cannot find the path back. "I told him about the trust, and he said he could help settle the matter, and I did not ask him how." "Then you knew enough," Martha said. Cal had gone for the sheriff in the first minutes of the fire, a standing instruction from Zeke that Cal had followed with the literal-minded reliability that made him valuable in a crisis. The sheriff arrived with 2 deputies as the barn completed its fall, the roof going in a cascade of sparks that rose into the cold January sky like a terrible celebration. And by the time the burning had settled to the stage of managing the remains rather than fighting the fire, Silas Thorne and Vivian Crowley were in the custody of 2 deputies with the efficient grimness of law that has clear physical evidence and multiple witnesses and very little patience for elaboration. Thorne went without dignity, which Martha noted as confirmation of her assessment of him. Vivian, as the deputy, took her arm, looked at Martha across the yard with an expression that Martha could not entirely characterize. Something in it that was beyond the usual repertoire, something that might have been in another woman under other circumstances a form of shame. Martha turned away. Zeke was on his feet by the time she got back to him, which she had expected. He was the kind of man who got back on his feet. Cal had brought a lantern, and Fletcher's wife, a small, capable woman named June, who lived in the foreman's cottage and who Martha had spoken to perhaps a dozen times, but who appeared in a crisis with the manner of someone who has been waiting for exactly. This had brought a basin and clean cloth and was working on the cut at Zeke's temple with the focused precision of a woman who has tended wounds before and is not bothered by the doing of it. The children had come off the porch. Henry arrived first at a run and attached himself to Zeke's right side with both arms and his full weight, saying nothing, which was so unlike Henry that it communicated the depth of his fear more precisely than any words could have. Eliza stood at Zeke's left and looked at the smoking remains of the barn, with the contained expression she used for the things that were too large to process, immediately the expression of a child filing something away, to feel later when she had the privacy for it. Ruth had found Martha appearing at her side, without sound or announcement in the manner she had, and Martha felt the small hand close around 2 of her fingers and hold on with the grip of someone who has found the fixed point and intends to maintain contact with it. Martha closed her hand around Ruth's and held on. She stood in the yard in her nightclothes in the January cold, with a small child's hand in hers, and looked at the smoking ruin of the barn and felt the full weight of the nightland on her. Not the fear which had been present throughout, but had been overridden by necessity, but the aftermath of fear, the way it collects in the body once the emergency has passed and presents itself for acknowledgement. She breathed through it slowly and deliberately, the way she breathed through the things she had to survive. And Ruth's hand was warm in hers, and after a moment Zeke was beside her. He stood close. She could feel the warmth of him through the cold. His shoulder was against hers, not leaning, just present, and Henry was still attached to his right side, and it was Ruth who moved first, releasing Martha's hand and reaching out for Zeke's large hand with her free one, so that they were connected, the four of them, through the child in the cold, and the smoke, and the orange fading light of what had been his barn. Zeke looked down at Ruth for a moment, and then at Martha, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything, because the moment did not require speech. It required exactly what it had: the four of them standing in the yard with the evidence of destruction behind them, and the house still whole and lit ahead of them, and all of them present, and all of them intact. June made coffee because June was a woman who understood that coffee was what people needed after catastrophe, and they all went inside, the hands and the children, and Martha and Zeke, into the kitchen that had been the center of this household's revival for 3 months, and the kitchen was warm and the lamps were lit, and the smell of smoke on all of them was the smell of a thing survived. The sheriff came to the house before he left with his prisoners, a solid, methodical man named Briggs, who had the manner of someone who prefers clarity to ceremony. He sat at the kitchen table and took down the accounts, Martha's and Fletcher's and Cal's and Zeke's, with the systematic thoroughness of a man building a case he intends to prosecute completely. Thorne's history with the Harrow land was known in the county, as were the debts behind it, and the deliberate burning of a man's barn in the night was not a charge that a frontier court was inclined to treat with leniency. Vivian's involvement was more complicated, as complicity in an act you did not explicitly authorize always is, but Briggs was clear that the matter was not resolved in her favor. The trust, Martha said, when the basic account had been taken. The legal situation with my inheritance. Will the charges against Mrs. Crowley affect the claims against the estate? Briggs looked at her steadily. Crane's a lawyer. He'll distance himself from this before morning, but the original trust transfer, that's a clean legal matter. Document transferred on your 30th birthday. Crane's claim on the assets is the thing to challenge, and with the circumstances of tonight, I'd say the leverage behind that claim has shifted considerably. He paused. You'll want your own lawyer, but I wouldn't be overly worried. She nodded. Briggs closed his ledger and stood. He looked at Zeke, and something passed between the two men in the way that things pass between people who have known each other long enough in a place small enough that the knowing goes deep without requiring extensive expression. Hell of a night, Zeke, he said. Yes, Zeke said. Barn can be rebuilt, Briggs said. Yes, Zeke said. Briggs went out, and the kitchen settled into the particular quiet of very late night, when the crisis has been resolved, and the accounting will come with the morning, and the people in the room are too exhausted for anything except the most essential things. The children fell asleep in the kitchen. Henry first tipping sideways in his chair with the abruptness of a boy whose body has decided the crisis is over, and sleep is non-negotiable, caught by Zeke's arm before he hit the floor and transferred to the settle near the stove, with the ease of a man who has been catching this particular boy for 2 years. Ruth was already asleep against Martha's side, the small body gone completely slack with the total surrender of young children to exhaustion. Eliza held out longer, sitting at the table with her hands around a cup of warm milk that Martha had made her, watching the room with her precise dark eyes until her eyes stopped being precise and became heavy, and she looked at Martha with the expression she used when she was about to say something she had decided required saying. "Is it going to be all right?" Eliza said. She meant the barn and the ranch and Thorne and all of it, And she also meant something more than all of that Martha knew, because Eliza was 11 and perceptive, and had been watching this household with the careful attention of someone who understands that the things that happen in it will determine the shape of her life. "Yes," Martha said, "it is going to be all right." Eliza looked at her for a moment, assessing the answer with the rigor she applied to most things. Then she nodded with the deliberate trust of a child who has decided to accept a thing on the evidence of the person offering it, and closed her eyes and was asleep within 2 minutes. Zeke carried her upstairs. He came back down and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at Martha, who was still at the table, with Ruth warm and sleeping against her side. And the look between them was the look of two people standing on the far side of something they have come through together. And the landscape on this side is different from the landscape on the other side, and neither of them is the same person they were when they entered it. He came and sat across from her. The kitchen was quiet. The stove ticked and breathed. Outside, the cold January dark was beginning the first imperceptible lightening that precedes dawn by an hour more feeling than fact, the world remembering that it is capable of becoming something other than night. "When the beam came down," he said, "and I heard you come through the smoke. I heard your voice before I could see anything." He stopped. He looked at his hands on the table, the familiar posture, and then he looked up, and his face was entirely open in the way she had only seen it a few times, and that she had understood each time as the most significant thing she was being shown. "I was not afraid of dying. I have not been afraid of dying for a long time. I was afraid that you would not get out." Martha sat with this. "Ezekiel," she said, and used his full name without having planned to, and heard in the sound of it something she had not heard in her own voice before, the sound of a woman who has decided to stop managing the distance between herself and the thing she wants most. "I know," he said. "I know what I am. I know what I carry. The grief and the guilt and the superstition about the curse that I cannot entirely reason myself out of. I know it is not a simple thing to take on." "I did not ask for a simple thing," she said. "I asked for an honest one." He was quiet. "I charged into a burning barn tonight," she said, and her voice had the steadiness it always had, but beneath the steadiness was something warm and very much alive. Something that had been kept carefully below the surface for 30 years and had decided in the aftermath of fire and cold and the grip of a small child's hand that the surface was where it intended to be. "I pulled you out of it. I am not telling you this as a demonstration of strength, Zeke. I am telling you because I need you to understand that I am not afraid of difficult things. I have spent my whole life being told I am a burden and a creature, and not worth the wanting. I have believed it in the weak parts of myself more than I should have. But I am standing here in my own kitchen in the house I have kept for 3 months with your children asleep upstairs, and I am telling you that I know what this is, what I feel, and I am not afraid of it, and I need to know if you are." He looked at her for a long time. The kind of long time that is not hesitation, but accumulation, a man gathering everything he is and pointing it in a single direction. "No," he said, "I am done being afraid of it." He reached across the table and took her hand. Both of them, the way he had the night of the lantern and the blisters, and he held them with the same care but different, because then he had been tending a wound, and now he was holding a person, all of her, the broad, strong hands and the solid, capable wrists and everything they were attached to, and he held them like someone who has decided that the thing in his hands is the thing he intends to keep. "Martha Bell Crowley," he said, and his voice had the low, certain quality it always had, but with something in it she had not heard before, something that was the vocal equivalent of the unguarded face, all his defenses down and his whole self present. "I would like to ask you something." "Yes," she said. She said it before he asked, which was the answer to what he was asking and also to everything else. His face changed. It was not a dramatic change. It was the change of a man to whom something has been restored that he had stopped believing was possible. The return of something that looks, when it comes back after long absence, like the simplest thing in the world, though it is not. He looked at her, and he was glad the way he had told her he was glad in the kitchen that evening, but larger now, the word too small for the thing it was trying to hold. He did not let go of her hands. Outside, the first gray of dawn was beginning at the edges of the ridge, the sky releasing the night in the patient way of skies that have done this an uncountable number of times and will do it an uncountable number of times more. The dark going not all at once but in degrees, the stars yielding one by one to a light that is not dramatic but is complete. And the snow on the hollow and the ridge lines and the fence rows picked up the first pale color of it and held it. And Black Hollow Ridge on that January morning looked in the growing light like what it was, a place that had been through fire and cold and grief and the long suspension of a household that had forgotten how to be a home and was in the particular patient way of good land and sound timber and people who were stubborn enough to stay becoming something again. Spring came. The barn went up in 6 weeks because the men of the surrounding ranches came with their tools and their time, in the way that communities in difficult country still came to each other in those years when the alternative to mutual aid was the kind of solitude that kills more certainly than any weather. Fletcher organized it with the quiet authority of a man who has been waiting for a reason to be organized, and Cal turned out to be an unexpectedly skilled framer, and by the time the cottonwoods along the creek were budding out in their first pale green, the new barn was framed and roofed, and the horses were back in stalls that were better built than what the fire had taken. The legal matter of the trust was resolved with the assistance of a lawyer in the county seat, who took the case with interest when the circumstances of Thorne's arrest became clear, and the lien claim dissolved with the same efficiency as Crane's confidence in pursuing it, and Martha Bell Crowley received clear title to 40 acres in Millhaven County, and a sum of money that was modest but real. She did not go to look at the property until April. She went with Zeke. They were married in March in the parlor of Black Hollow Ridge by the circuit preacher who came through on his quarterly visit and seemed unsurprised by the request, as men who travel wide territories become unsurprised by most human arrangements. It was a small occasion because neither of them wanted a large one. Fletcher and June were witnesses. The children were present. Henry in his best shirt with his hair brushed flat in a configuration that lasted approximately 11 minutes. Eliza in the blue dress Martha had made her from the fabric she found in the upstairs trunk, Ruth in her arms for the ceremony itself because Ruth had decided that this was where she intended to be, and no adult present was inclined to argue with her. Zeke said his words with the flat, certain directness he brought to everything that mattered, and Martha said hers with the steadiness she had always had and the warmth beneath it that she no longer kept below the surface, and the preacher pronounced them married, and Zeke kissed her with the focused, unhurried attention of a man who has decided that this is not a performative act, but a real one. And Henry made a sound of theatrical disgust that he had clearly prepared in advance. And Eliza said, "Henry," with the patient long-suffering of an older sister, and Ruth from Martha's arms reached up and put one small hand on Zeke's face and one on Martha's and held them both, and that was how they were married in the parlor where the paper chains still hung, faded on the Christmas tree that no one had quite gotten around to removing in the house that had been a grieving house and was not a grieving house anymore. The barn was done by the time they went to see the Millhaven property. They rode out together on a Saturday in April with the children and Cal and Fletcher in the wagon, and the property was what the lawyer had described, 40 acres of good grass with the creek along its eastern line, and a small farmhouse that needed work but was sound in its bones. Ruth ran through the new grass with her arms out and her dark hair loose. Henry found the creek and was in it up to his knees within 4 minutes of arrival. Eliza walked the fence line with her careful attention and came back with specific observations about where the posts needed replacing, which Zeke wrote down in his pocketbook with the seriousness her report deserved. Martha stood in the middle of the field and looked at the creek and the ridge beyond it, and the sky that was the specific blue of an April morning when the cold has finally released and the world is beginning again, and she thought about her grandmother Edith Morse, who had smelled of lavender and given peppermints from her coat pocket, and had quietly, without announcement, left a field and a farmhouse, and a sum of money to a granddaughter she had not known well enough, as if she had understood somehow that the girl was going to need a piece of ground that was nobody's charity. Zeke came and stood beside her. "Good land," he said. "Yes," she said. "What will you do with it?" he said, and she heard in the question the real question, which was not about acreage, but about her, about what she wanted, what she had decided for herself, and this was something she had not been asked very often, and she heard it now, with the full weight of the fact that the person asking it meant it wanted the real answer would receive whatever the real answer was. "Keep it," she said. "Let it work alongside the Harrow land, something for the children when they're grown." She paused. "Something that was my mother's people's, something that was always meant to be mine." He nodded slowly, and his hand found hers at her side, and they stood in the April field together and watched their children move through the new grass, and the creek light and the ridge above them was the particular color of spring, on limestone green and gray and gold, where the sun caught the new growth, and the creek made its sound over the stones, which was the sound of water, doing what water has always done, which is move forward, which is refuse to be held still, which is find its way through whatever the land puts in front of it and arrive eventually at the place it was always going. 1 year after Martha Crowley first arrived at Black Hollow Ridge, on an October evening when the leaves on the cottonwoods had gone to gold and the air had the first edge of coming cold in it, she stood on the porch of the rebuilt house in the blue hour before full dark and watched the hollow settle into night. The new barn was lit from within the lantern glow through the boards, warm and amber, and she could hear Henry's voice from its direction, engaged in a detailed, one-sided conversation with the orphan lambs that had grown into sheep of considerable size and what appeared to be genuine affection for his company. Eliza was inside at the kitchen table, working through her arithmetic with the focused intensity she brought to things she intended to master, and Ruth was asleep already early, as she always went down, curled in her bed with her collection of smooth stones and her dried flour and the small rag doll that Martha had made her in February from a scrap of blue calico. She heard Zeke step on the porch boards and felt his presence behind her, the solid warmth of him, and his arms came around her from behind in the quiet, easy way of two people who have learned each other his hands, resting at her waist with a naturalness that was not performed and was not careful and was not tentative, the hands of a man who knows where he is and is not afraid of being there. She felt him press his face briefly to her hair. "Henry is telling the sheep about the supply run," she said. She felt more than heard the low sound of his laugh against her. It was still a rare thing, his laugh, but she had been collecting them for months in the private interior catalog she kept of the things that mattered, and each one was specific, and hers. "The sheep appear to have strong opinions about the price of feed," he said. "They're good listeners," she said. "It's a quality." He was quiet, and she was quiet, and the hollow went dark by degrees, and the first stars appeared, and his arms were around her with a steady weight of presence, not possessive, not enclosing just there, the way certain things are just there when they are right, without requiring justification or explanation. "I need you to know something," he said against her hair, in the low voice he used for the things that mattered. "Tell me," she said. "I thought for a long time that I was the kind of man that loss follows, that anyone who stayed close to me was in the path of it." He paused. "I do not think that now." She turned in his arms, not out of them, just enough to look at his face in the blue October dark. The face she had learned over a year of mornings and evenings and crises and ordinary days, the face of a man who has come back from a very far interior distance, and is present now, fully present in a way that costs something, and is worth every bit of what it costs. "What do you think now?" she said. "I think," he said, "that you walked into a burning building for me, and that I am the luckiest man on this ridge." She looked at him for a long moment with everything she was not the managed surface, not the steadiness she performed for the world, but all of it, the depth and the fullness and the complicated human warmth of a woman who was told for 30 years she was too much, and has discovered in this hollow, in this house, in the arms of this particular man, that the people doing the telling were wrong about every single thing. "You are," she agreed, and he laughed again, and she felt it against her, and the October stars were out in full above the ridge, and Black Hollow Ridge was lit and warm and alive below them, and Martha Bell Harrow was home.